Your son will never get a quirk. The words rang through the ears of young Izuku Midoriya even as his mother drove him home from the quirk clinic. His mother drove in silence while Izuku stared down at his feet, or more specifically, his toes. 2 joints, 1 in each little toe, was all the doctor needed to look at before writing him off as a lost cause, part of the 10% of society that was powerless, quirkless. As they pulled into the parking structure of their building, Izuku tried hard not to think about all the things he would miss out on by being quirkless. He wouldn't get to show off cool powers in class like Kaken did. He wouldn't be able to punch through buildings like All Might. He couldn't even have his father study his quirk like he did for so many others as a quirk doctor in America. But maybe, just maybe, he could still be a hero. As he rewatched his favorite video of All Might saving people from a building, smiling the whole way, he couldn't help but think that even if he was quirkless, that was what he was going to do with his life, save people with a smile. And so, even as his mother told him that she was sorry, leaving unspoken her lack of faith in his dreams, Izuku remained firm. He was going to be a hero like All Might, and he wasn't going to let being quirkless stop him. That belief, however, didn't sit well with others, his best friend Bakugo Katsuki most of all. It was him that gave him the nickname Deku, useless. He was also the one currently staring down Izuku as he stood over the boy that Bakugo and his 2 cronies had been bullying before. I won't let you hurt him anymore, Kaken. That's not what heroes do, Izuku protested, his wide green-gray eyes frantically watching the small explosions crackle in his best friend's hands. Useless little Deku, you're even more worthless than the extra behind you. You'll never be a hero without a quirk. That's just not how the world works. I'll even prove it to you, Deku, Katsuki said in a childish drawl, his wide smirk matched by his 2 companions. Izuku knew he was about to get beat up, he just couldn't match Katsuki and his 2 followers. Even if he had a quirk, 3v1 wasn't exactly fair. Hey Extra, if you help us beat up Deku, we won't bother you anymore. How's that for a deal? Bakugo asked the downed boy he had been beating previously. Izuku froze in a cold sweat. Surely the boy wouldn't, he was trying to help, and Bakugo was. That thought process quickly died as he felt a small foot connect with the back of his knee, causing him to fall on the ground in front of Kaken. See Deku, even the people you try to help are better than you, you're just a useless nothing. Get with the program, Deku, you're never going to be a hero. Katsuki bragged before sending a strong kick into Izuku's side as he made to stand up. Izuku let out a yelp of pain as he felt the 4 boys continue to kick him, could hear Katsuki's hands crackling with small explosions fueled by his excitement. And all he could think was why. Why was he born quirkless? Why Kaken had to be so mean? Why the boy had helped Kaken when he was just bullying him instead of Izuku? Why? The word ran constantly through Izuku's head as he felt every kick connect before finally stopping on one final question. Why was the world so unfair? And for the first time in his short life, Izuku got angry. It wasn't fair, it wasn't right, and there was nothing he could do about it except scream his protests. It was bubbling in his stomach, slowly expanding outwards to his skin. The rage he was feeling was all-encompassing. It made him stronger. He couldn't even feel the kicks anymore. All he could feel was the rage building within him, filling him until it burst outwards in a mighty roar. And just like that, Izuku knew nothing more. Across the city, Shota Aizawa was not a happy man. Not only had he been pulled for an extra day shift on top of his usual night shift, he was also forced to partner with Hisashi, also known by his hero name of Present Mike. A good friend, but not a person he would choose to deal with when he was running on less than 2 hours of sleep and the beginning of a bad case of dry eye. All he wanted to do was go to bed. But here he was, parked on a cafe rooftop. You hear that, Shota? Sounds like they need backup at the park. Let's roll, Mike said before turning and jumping across the rooftops towards the park at the heart of the city. Honestly, why Mike got so excited over what was probably a minor villain trying to kidnap some kid, Shota wasn't sure, but as he followed, he couldn't help but feel this was going to be something a bit bigger. The sounds of sirens going the same direction as himself proved him to be correct. When he arrived at the scene, Aizawa was shocked to see several small-time heroes already laid out across the park, Ingenium rushing about bringing them out of the combat zone to safety. Mike was near the ambulances, sending his sonic blasts towards Death Arms and the slightly smaller figurine that was currently beating him across the park. The villain was smaller than Aizawa would have expected, but that didn't mean anything to their apparent strength. Some of the heroes he saw broken across the ground were known for their strength if nothing else, and it was clear the only reason Death Arms was lasting this long was because his opponent fought like a berserker rather than with any skill. On top of being just shorter than the average adult, the villain had gray skin, tinged with a faint green, and a wild mane of black hair, also with a faint green tint when the light hit it. It was also built like a mini All Might, that is to say, all muscles built on top of even more muscle that still seemed stronger than it looked. Eraserhead, can you shut it down? Mike called over, taking a break from distracting the gray berserker as it again tried to break through Death Arms' guard. A hard stare later and Aizawa knew he was going to be useless this fight, as the berserker didn't even show a single sign of slowing down or transforming into a person. All the weariness he felt drained away, replaced by determination and a small amount of fear. This was going to be much harder than he first thought. Nothing, I don't think we can take it down as is. We need to stall for someone stronger to get here to put it down. Aizawa shouted back before preparing himself to go in. While he couldn't stop the beast, he could most certainly slow it down until someone with more raw power arrived to finish the job. Roger! Mike shouted, the usual cheer gone from his voice as he again blasted the gray-skinned berserker, who barely seemed to notice the sonic attack beyond giving a roar and smashing even harder at Death Arms. Aizawa quickly leapt in and sent a kick at the side of the berserker's face from behind, and was utterly shocked when it barely flinched, only sending a wild sweat backwards and knocking Aizawa into the wall of a building roughly. Careless, no wonder only Death Arms was able to hold this thing off. He was the only one capable of getting enough force in one spot for the thing to even feel his attacks. As Aizawa sat up, he saw a shadow descending from overhead even as the berserker finally landed a solid punch into Death Arms' stomach, sending him flying across the park and through a wall, where he was slow to get up. Before the berserker could pursue his fallen foe, Ingenium sped his way with an assault of speed and powered blows, only to have both his punches caught and his arms broken in a painful grip before being casually tossed aside by the relentless berserker. Fortunately, he was caught by Ryukyu in her dragon form as the number 9 ranked hero descended onto the field, blocking off the berserker from reaching the slowly rising Death Arms. Eraser! Help Death Arms! I should be able to finish this guy off. Ryukyu called to Aizawa, who could only nod and acknowledge how outmatched he was in this fight. With the promotional fight between All Might and Endeavor happening in a week's time, at the number 2 hero's insistence, a great majority of the more powerful heroes were 2 cities over, and unable to come match the berserker in a timely manner, only Ryukyu's flight had let her arrive soon enough to make a difference, no matter how small that might be. Already the park was in ruins, and Aizawa could see the injured forms of multiple children being loaded into an ambulance and being driven away from the scene. Whoever this guy was, he was going down. You see what started this? Aizawa asked Death Arms as he helped him get away from the Ryukyu and the berserker squaring off. I was here since the start, whatever that thing is, it came from inside the park, tearing everything apart and going after some kids. I was the one that gave them enough time to get away, but one had severely broken fingers and another 2 had broken legs. The blonde was worst off, ribs, a leg and both his arms were a mess in a matter of seconds. Lucky Ingenium was near enough to get them all away while I fought that thing because even now it's going after them. And even as Aizawa turned to face the fight between the top 10 hero and the smaller berserker, he could see Death Arms was telling the truth. Even as it picked up a fallen tree and tried to club Ryukyu with it, it also chucked it in the direction the ambulance with the boys he had seen leave in. It's intelligent, maybe not human level, but enough to pick certain targets. Aizawa realized, the pain mixed with growing concern for the ongoing fight driving away any lingering exhaustion he might have been feeling. Yeah, let's just hope Ryukyu can take this thing down. Otherwise that thing's gonna tear through the city to get after those kids. Death Arms agreed, gingerly holding his undoubtedly broken ribs as Aizawa led him to a waiting medic. Get back out there, Eraser. They're gonna need all the help they can get, Death Arms said, before finally passing out. Only now could Aizawa see just how bad of shape the man was really in. His titanium arm guards were heavily cracked and almost shattered in places. One of his arms was undoubtedly broken and both his shoulder looked like they were popped from their sockets. All that, and he kept going until a lucky punch had done in most of his ribs and damn near caved in his chest cavity. Truly a plus ultra performance from the punching hero. Stealing his resolve, Aizawa jumped back out to the front lines as Ryukyu and the Berserker continued their fight. While his strength was certainly impressive, it seemed that the smaller Berserker couldn't move Ryukyu. Not could his blows truly hurt her through her diamond-hard scales. But on the flip side, he was agile enough to dodge away from his larger opponent's slower blows. It was a stalemate, but Aizawa couldn't see that lasting long. Ryukyu had more cards left to play than the Berserker, and all it would take was one good hit to put him down. That hit came as the Berserker ducked under a claw swipe from the Dragon Hero, who quickly continued her momentum and smacked the Berserker with her tail in a mighty swing, causing a small explosion of force and a dust cloud to rise. Aizawa waited patiently for the dust to clear, to see if the Berserker was truly put down by the strong blow from Ryukyu's tail, but what he saw was not something he, nor anyone else, was expecting. Instead of being crushed under Ryukyu's tail, the Berserker had caught the dragon's rearmost appendage and was slowly pulling on it, even as Ryukyu tried to pull her tail out of the Berserker's grasp. Scar smash! With a mighty roar of fury, the muscular gray-skinned Berserker heaved and threw Ryukyu's entire body and smashed the heroine into the ground, drawing a cry of pain from her draconic maw. Before he could jump into the fight to stall for Ryukyu to recover, Aizawa saw a familiar pink mist forming around the Berserker. It took a few seconds, but eventually it had inhaled enough and it collapsed in a heap, put to sleep by Midnight's quirk. Once the mist had dispersed, Aizawa was one of the first to approach the sleeping Berserker. Scar it had called itself, ready to react in case it lashed out again. But it was well and truly asleep, and seemed to be shrinking as well. To Aizawa and many others' shock, it shrunk until the once powerful Berserker was reduced to the form of a small sleeping child no older than 4. Aizawa watched as handcuffs were put on him and he was carried to a cop car, following in case he awoke and transformed again, but he doubted he would be necessary. The kid had a powerful quirk and it was probably his first time using it, which was why he lost control. But standard procedure was to arrest the perp, which was something he had argued against. Showing the kid that cops were the bad guy was not something that would go well in the long run, and he never wanted to be on the receiving end of the boy's Berserker form. But Aizawa only watched as the boy was unloaded and taken into the police precinct. He wished the boy well, but he would never forget that underneath the innocent freckles and wavy hair hid a raging monster just waiting to be set free. The boy had potential if he could get himself under control while he transformed, and Aizawa was interested to see if he could live up to it. Maybe he would take that teaching job he had been offered after all. Of course, the fact that he could sleep through class just like he had when he was in school himself was another benefit. Aizawa yawned and began the long journey to his awaiting bed back home. Potential indeed. In the precinct, Toshinori Yagi had come as soon as he saw the news. While he hadn't been fast enough to stop the gray-skinned Berserker that called itself Scar himself, he was there fast enough to claim guard duty over the sleeping child that held the beast within. And upon seeing the boy, any doubts he had previously had were erased. The quirk could have been a coincidence, but the boy's face was almost identical to his father's. Match that with an almost identical quirk, and All Might knew exactly who he was dealing with. It had been years since he had been to America and last spoken to the man in person, but when he had, Bruce had been certain that he had gotten rid of his own quirk, completely erased it from his DNA. And yet, here was living proof that the Hulk, the only opponent to ever overpower him, wasn't as dead as the world thought it was. Toshinori knew he had to watch over the boy, while he was confident in his ability to avenge his late master. If All for One got his hands on this quirk, the result would be disastrous. Not to mention he owed it to his old friend for helping him completely master One for All. So for now he would wait, and he would vouch for the boy when he woke up. His father had been feared and chained because of his powerful and out-of-control quirk, but All Might would see the boy in front of him become whatever he wanted to. After all, it was a hero's duty to meddle when they weren't wanted if it meant helping someone else. Izuku woke up slowly. His eyes felt heavy, and all of his tiny, undeveloped muscles ached. It wasn't until he reached up to straighten his hair that he realized one important detail. He was in handcuffs. Once he came to that realization, he quickly came to several more. He wasn't in his bed, but on a dingy cot with a semi-clean woolen blanket. There was an exposed toilet and sink in the corner of the room, but no mirror over it. He wasn't in his room, he was in a jail cell. Izuku felt his heart rate spike as panic began to spread into his bones. He felt a warmth spreading through his chest and begin flowing through his body. Then that feeling was cut off and Izuku almost collapsed on the floor, barely managing to catch himself on the edge of the bed as he made to stand. He was right after all, my quirk only works if you are in the process of transforming. A dry, tired voice spoke from the other side of the bars. Izuku turned his attention to the figure on the other side, who was leaning against the far wall, his goggle-covered eyes facing Izuku in an intense stare. He was dressed in all black and had long black hair that looked like it was constantly ruffled. Around the man's neck was what looked like a long white bandage. If Izuku had to guess, he was still in his early 20s, but the lines on his face made him seem older. "What?" Izuku tried to ask, his voice stumbling as he took in man that looked to be a hero. "Your quirk activated for the first time, sent you on a rampage. You injured several pros and bystanders before you were brought under control. So now you're here until the higher-ups can decide what to do with you," the man said, his voice never wavering from its deadpan. "But the doctor said I didn't have a quirk, that I was quirkless," Izuku said in a small voice, curling into himself as he sat on the old bed. "Well, they were wrong, and there's a hospital ward full to prove it," he replied before falling silent, his gaze still set on Izuku. Izuku could feel his heart racing again, once again in fear, but for a different reason. He had hurt innocent people, he had hurt heroes. How monstrous was his quirk that he would do something so against everything he stood for. He felt his heart start to race again, the warmth spreading through his chest, until once again it was cut off and Izuku almost fell over again. "Stop doing that, kid. You're giving me dry eye over here," the man complained, rubbing his brow over his goggles. Izuku paused his thoughts and took in what the man had said. "You mean that warm feeling in my chest? That's my quirk activating, and you're stopping it?" He was watching the man closely. He was pretty sure he knew who this was, but it didn't hurt to be certain. "Yeah, I'm erasing your quirk. That's why I'm here. You're Eraserhead, the new underground hero who specializes in ambush tactics and busting crime rings." Izuku felt his heart rate spike in excitement as he gushed about the hero in front of him, the warm feeling once again spreading before it was stripped from him for a third time in as many minutes. "Geez, kid, are you doing that on purpose, or is your quirk just going off on its own?" That cut Izuku off of his rant more than the cold feeling in his chest. "It's my quirk, I guess. I'm not trying to use it," he mumbled out as Eraserhead gave a sigh of resignation. "I thought so, but you'll have to get a handle on that if you ever want to get out of here, because I can't follow you around everywhere keeping your quirk in check." "Eraserhead, is he awake?" a voice asked from down the hall, drawing the attention of both the child and the hero in the jail. "Yeah. Are they ready for him, Naomesa?" "We are. You have been requested to stay with us just in case, though." The voice, apparently belonging to a man named Naomesa, replied, and Eraserhead made his way to the door of the cell and opened it, beckoning for Izuku to follow him out. Of course, Izuku's heart rate spiked and Eraserhead was once again forced to erase his quirk before whatever it was could take hold. Izuku made his way from the cell, down a series of hallways, and into a small room, where 3 men were waiting for him, with Eraserhead bringing up the rear. The man in the middle and sitting opposite from the table was an average-looking man, dressing in a detective's uniform, the coat hanging over the back of his chair. The second was a tall, lanky man with sagging blonde hair. His blue eyes seemed to go right through Izuku, unnerving him. At first Izuku thought he was almost skeletal, but under the man's oversized white shirt, he could see a foundation of muscles that rivaled a professional bodybuilder. The last man was older. He had a large white mustache and his white hair was slicked back. He wasn't of Japanese descent, but the American military uniform pointed to his origins. "Welcome, Izuku," the detective in the middle spoke in a calming voice. "I am Detective Tsukachi Naomesa, and while I would like nothing more than to let you go, there are a few things that need to be addressed first," he explained, his voice soothing Izuku and keeping him calmer than he would have been. Izuku gave a shaky nod, the handcuffs around his wrists making a light clanging sound against the table as he did so. Is it really necessary to have him in handcuffs? The blonde inquired, glaring at the offending pieces of metal around Izuku's wrists. Unfortunately, yes. Until this meeting is over, I am required by law to leave them on. Naomasa replied with a sigh, giving a small glare at the American, who only nodded stiffly. All right, let's begin then, the blonde said, focusing his attention on Izuku. Name Midoriya Izuku. Age 4. 2 months ago you were diagnosed quirkless by Dr. Daruma Ojiko. Our own tests have pulled the same conclusion. There is an explanation for this, however, Yagi, if you would, Naomasa said, gesturing to the blonde. Of course, detective. Young Midoriya, I have worked with your father, one Dr. Bruce Banner, in America before. He possesses the same quirk you do. In America, he is kept in a government laboratory and under watch at all times in case his quirk activates. He is only allowed to use his quirk when the government deems it appropriate, and they deploy him only in worst-case scenarios. As Mr. Yagi spoke, Izuku felt his head spinning as he took in information he had never known about his father. Dr. Banner is a friend of mine, and I believe the reason you appear to be quirkless to our tests is his doing. Mr. Yagi continued, his face aging before Izuku's eyes. Your father hates his quirk and has been experimenting on himself in an attempt to get rid of it. About 6 years ago, he believed he was successful, and he passed the tests put forth by the American government and was released from the labs he was being held in. I was the one who brought him to Japan to celebrate his newfound freedom, and that was when he met your mother, Midoriya Inko. The more he spoke, the more Izuku couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was almost surreal to him. They were quickly married, but several months after you were born, the American government decided that it was too dangerous to have him out of the country, and he was deported back to America and sent back to the labs, as a full-time researcher this time instead of only part-time. He believes his quirk to be permanently gone, but either he wasn't as through as he thought or he only got rid of it in himself but not his ability to pass the quirk down. My belief is that he destabilized his own quirk factor, which made it so while his quirk is still present within him, he has locked it away. When you were born, you inherited his quirk, but it changed as it became your own quirk. Your own quirk factor is unstable like your father's, but instead of preventing your quirk from activating, it instead makes you seem quirkless to the normal tests, when the truth is you are anything but. Mr. Yagi concluded, his sharp blue eyes watching Izuku carefully. Which is exactly why he should be taken to America and undergo the same procedure as his father, to lock away his quirk. The world doesn't need any raging berserkers running around. The American barked, his eyes boring into Izuku, who needed another erasure form Eraserhead to keep his quirk from activating from his fear of the American. May I remind you, General Ross, that you are only a visitor here on Japanese soil, and that Izuku is a Japanese citizen. While we appreciate the offer, that is not how we operate here. Naomasa harshly rebuked the man, his kind eyes darkening at the general. Before we reach any conclusions, would you mind telling us what you remember from the park, young Midoriya? Mr. Yagi asked, the tone of his voice softer. And so Izuku told them. He told them about the bullying trio, although he refused to name them. He told them about the injured boy who had joined them, and he told them about the anger he had felt before the warm feeling overtook him and he blacked out. I see, very well then. In accordance with the First Awakening Act, you will not be penalized for any actions that occurred during the first time you used your quirk. That being said, you will be held responsible in the future. Naomasa said, finally taking the handcuffs off of Izuku, who could only feel relief. That being said, you need to learn to control your quirk, not let it control you. My recommendation is to have your mother enter you into a quirk rehabilitation center, where you will get experience in how to control your quirk in an environment where you can be controlled if you do lose control. Mr. Yagi continued, drawing a snort from Ross. Good luck controlling that monster. It would take someone as strong as All Might to keep him down, Ross said, disdain staining his voice. Seeing as I work in his main office and know All Might is on good terms with Dr. Banner, I'm sure he would be willing to work with young Midoriya when I inform him of the situation. Mr. Yagi shot back. Izuku needed another erasure as his heart spiked from excitement. All Might willing to help him. He had so many questions he wanted to ask the #1 hero. Eraserhead and Naomasa both gave small snorts at his obvious fanboy tendencies. Mr. Yagi only looked amused. And AC from All Might, I can keep him from transforming, and my colleague Midnight was the one who knocked him out this time, and both of us would be willing to help from time to time. Eraserhead added on the Mr. Yagi's point, drawing a warm smile from the blonde man. Ross gave one final grunt of disagreement before turning sharply and leaving the room. Izuku was glad to see the American leave. He finally had a quirk, and even if he couldn't control it right now, he had one. And that meant he could be a hero. Before I leave, Izuku started, surprising Naomasa, who had been going over some paperwork. But what exactly is my quirk? Izuku asked, drawing a nervous look from all three men in the room. We can play the news report for you, but they aren't very nice in it. Naomasa warned and led Izuku to another room. Izuku assumed it was his office, and he pulled up a video on his laptop before turning the machine so Izuku could watch the video. Izuku watched in muted awe and fear as the news reporter commentated the fight between a small gray-green skinned berserker with two-tone hair and death arms. He watched as almost a dozen sidekicks were tossed aside with barely a second thought. He watched Eraserhead get casually tossed aside. Death Arms and Ingenium both getting injured terribly until Ryukyu and Midnight finally took the berserker. Scar, down. Even after the video ended, Izuku stared at the black screen, still absorbing what he had seen. He could see why General Ross thought he needed to be controlled now. That much raw power and fighting ability, and it was only the first time his quirk had been active. The amount of power his quirk would obtain naturally without him pushing it become a hero was monstrous. With proper training, Izuku had no clue how strong he could get. Even as all these thoughts came and went, one thought stuck in his mind. He had seen that kind of fight before, from the only person to ever outpower All Might in a fight. My dad's the Hulk. Izuku breathed out, his heart beginning to race. For what felt like the 100th time that day, Eraserhead was forced to shut down his quirk from emerging. Keep Scar from emerging. Yes, he is. His identity is a guarded secret by the American government. But as his son, you have the right to know. Mr. Yagi responded, his eyes belaying some emotions Izuku couldn't decipher. Come on, Izuku. Your mother is here to pick you up, Naomasa said, gently leading the still shocked Izuku from his computer. After a tearful reunion with his mother, one that required Eraserhead to erase his quirk again, Naomasa gave Inko his recommendation. Take him right from here to the Mustafu Quirk Rehab Center. They're one of the best, and Eraserhead can stay with you for the trip there to ensure nothing goes wrong. He may not have been punished for his first offense, but he will be for future ones. Naomasa warned, Eraserhead silently agreeing behind him. Aye. Inko trailed off, still holding Izuku in her arms. Okay, we'll do it your way, but everyone there better treat my baby boy right, Inko insisted, pulling Izuku closer to herself. It'll be fine. I'll drive you myself while Naomasa finishes the paperwork here, Mr. Yagi offered, giving Inko a reassuring toothy smile. Thank you, Mr. Yagi, Inko said as they left the precinct, Eraserhead following the mother-son duo silently. The drive was filled with Inko voicing her worries about the facility while Mr. Yagi reassured her. Izuku just took it all in, still processing the truth of his quirk. Scar was unlike anything he had ever seen. He was untamed wild fury given form. Somehow contained within his scrawny frame lay a sleeping giant. The whole ride over, Eraserhead didn't say a word, but his gaze never wavered from Izuku's own silent form. As they arrived at the large building that reminded Izuku of a fortress, he turned to Izuku and gave him a smirk. You got potential, kid. Now it's up to you to live up to it. And with that, he slipped out of the car and leapt up to the rooftop, where he could keep watch over the building. Izuku held his mother's hand tightly as Mr. Yagi led them inside. There they were greeted by a receptionist, and after almost an hour of paperwork, a nurse came to show Izuku around the facility. My name is Nurse Enzu. If you would follow me, Izuku, we can get you settled in. Your mother will be back tomorrow with your belongings. The nurse greeted cheerfully, easing some of Izuku's fear. Izuku, Inko called to her son as Nurse Inzu took his hand and began to lead him into the facility. "You can become a hero, a great hero," she told him, a wide smile on her face, contrasting the waterfall of tears pouring from her eyes. Izuku's whole world brightened as his mother finally said the words he had been dying to hear. The fatigue he had been feeling since he woke up in the jail cell finally fading completely as a new hope took its place. Tears of joy fell down Izuku's face even as Nurse Enzu led him through the facility. "Since you're new here, it's our policy to assign an older sibling if you would," she explained as they walked through the hallway. "One of the patients who has been with us for a time will show you how things work, and if you are here for long enough, you might be asked to do the same." Izuku just nodded as he took in the hallways they were walking through. The rehab center was built like a hospital, but with small comfortable apartment-like spaces instead of the usual sterile rooms. "We usually only have somewhere around 50 patients at a time here. Some have to stay for years while others have a relatively fast turnaround time. Our most notable patient is the Rescue Hero 13. They were here for almost 2 years before being accepted into UA to fully master their quirk, Black Hole." Nurse Enzu explained to Izuku, who was wishing he had a notebook to write in. "And here we are." Nurse Enzu stopped at a pair of doors, one labeled and the other not. "You'll stay here while your big brother will be right next to you. If you need anything and don't feel comfortable going to a nurse, you can go to him," Nurse Enzu explained, knocking on the door. When it opened, Izuku was brought face to face with a red-haired teen, maybe 13 and 14 years old. He had wild, spiky hair that stuck out in all directions. His face was gaunt and his frame was skinny. He seemed even more fragile than Mr. Yagi did at first glance. "Izuku, this will be your big brother. While you stay here, say hi, why don't you?" Nurse Enzu said, drawing a light chuckle from the teen. "Hi," Izuku said in a small voice, slightly intimidated by the older boy, his natural nervousness shining through as he worked to keep himself calm, to keep Scar down. "Nice to meet you too, buddy," the teen said, reaching out and ruffling Izuku's own wild mop of hair. "My name's Toya Todoroki. Somewhere else, hidden laboratory." All for One was a patient man. It was his defining trait. He could wait generations for his plans to come to fruition. But if there was one thing that set him off like nothing else, it was a wasted opportunity. "You mean to tell me?" he began, rage dripping in his voice as he stared down his top doctor and researcher, "that you had the son of the Hulk in your hands, but you didn't realize who he was until the heroes got their hands on him." All for One was almost spitting mad at this point. Too many of his plans had been ruined by the great bluster that was All Might. The only time he had ever seen the man losing was against the Hulk, and he was locked away in America, far from his grasp. To hear that he could have stolen his son's quirk, but had missed the chance. "The only reason I know is because they had to use my office's records to confirm it was him. They are keeping his identity extremely confidential," Dr. Ujiko protested, his knees shaking slightly from the presence All for One was exuding. "Of course they are, and it would take an all-out assault to get to the boy now," All for One said, plans and ideas spawning and being discarded rapidly from his mind. "We'll just make a note of him for now, and if they leave him vulnerable, we can exploit it." "What did you say the boy's name was again?" "Izuku Midoriya, but his alter ego identified as Scar." "Scar." All for One said the name slowly, taking in everything he could from it. "I wonder what kind of piece you will end up being." Dr. Ujiko could only give a sigh of relief when his boss burst into mad laughter. He was off the hook, for now at least. That meant he could get back to his research into artificial creatures. And the vial he had of Midoriya's blood might just give him the tools he needed to finally be successful. The clinic, Izuku found, was both professional and well-equipped to deal with quirks of all kinds. Nurse Enzu's quirk, who Izuku had learned was going to be his personal nurse while he was learning to control his quirk, was perfectly suited to help him. She called it heartbeat, and it was as simple as it sounded. She could affect a person's heartbeat when she looked at them. She couldn't speed it up and slow it down to harmful levels, but she could set it to a stable 75 beats per minute. Incredibly useful to help calm down a potentially frantic patient, and perfect for keeping Scar locked away. Just like his father, Izuku's quirk came out when his heart rate accelerated for any reason. Anger, fear, nerves, excitement, any of it. And given his habit of growing overly nervous and excited for any number of reasons, the poor nurse had to use her quirk on him multiple times an hour. Because his constant need to have Nurse Enzu alongside him, even for simple things like bathing, which was rather embarrassing for the green-haired boy, he wasn't allowed to meet any occupants of the hospital except for his assigned big brother, Toya. Toya was rather apathetic towards Izuku. He would lead him around, eat with him, and answer any questions Izuku asked him within reason. But Izuku could see the boy was actively trying to keep a level of distance between the two of them, and Izuku hadn't worked up the nerve to ask the teen why. It was only after a month of observation that Izuku was brought into the heavily fortified training room, Prohero Midnight behind him, that he was allowed to use his quirk again. The goal was to see how much control he had over his second form, over Scar, when he voluntarily transformed instead of transforming in a moment of desperate rage. To say that the test went poorly was an understatement. Izuku was able to bring Scar to the surface easily enough. Without Nurse Enzu's quirk to hold his heartbeat steady, Izuku had more than enough anxiety to trigger the transformation. He felt the same bubbling sensation build in his stomach, felt it expand into his muscles and skin, then he blacked out. When he awoke an hour later, he learned that once he transformed, he had flown into a rampage that put dents into the 2-foot-thick steel walls almost instantly. On top of that, it took longer for Midnight's quirk to knock him out, which led the doctors to believe that even after only a single exposure, he was building a resistance against it. The next test was to see how mental quirks interacted with him while he transformed. A doctor with a mind-reading quirk was brought in to try and read his thoughts while he transformed. He passed out after only a few seconds in Scar's head while he rampaged through the sealed training room, and upon waking declared that Scar was a savage manifestation of Izuku's rage given form, his ID, and that under no circumstances was he going anywhere it ever again, nor did he believe that Izuku would ever have any level of control over it. With that disheartening news, Izuku slowly made his way to lunch with Toya, who was fresh from his own testing session. Izuku could always tell when Toya had won from the shaking in his hands, the red in his face, and slight scent of burnt flesh that accompanied him. The two ate in silence for a short while before Izuku broke it, his eyes shining with emotion that Nurse Enzu was forced to slow with her quirk from the next table over. Toya, do you think I can be a hero, even if all my quirk does is lash out and hurt people? Izuku asked his assigned older brother. Toya paused in his meal, clearly thinking over the question as he chewed his mouthful of food before setting his sandwich down. Lash out, you said? Then just point at what needs a beating. Don't even have to worry about collateral damage either. God knows heroes break just as much as villains in a fight. Toya said, his voice lacking emotion as usual. But how do I do that? Every time I try to use my quirk I black out. Izuku countered, looking for any kind of reassurance in Toya. Exposure and experience. Only way to get good at using a quirk is to use it. Once you've been here for a few years you'll realize that all this place does is give you a place to do that without endangering others, and a weakness in your own quirk to exploit and work with instead of against. The doctors are more like scientific wardens, honestly. Toya's response was dry and blunt, his features as flat as his tone as he spoke. Is that what you do? Practice your quirk to control it? Izuku asked, wishing he had a notebook to take notes on Toya's quirk, his building excitement forcing Nurse Enzu to use her quirk on him again. I'm a little different, Toya drawled, dragging the words out, his eyes falling away from Izuku and focusing on his food again. The green-haired half of the conversation waited until Toya continued. My quirk isn't suited to my body. My parents have vastly different emitter quirks, and I got stuck with my old man's emitter quirk, but my body is suited more to handle my mother's. Toya said, being intentionally leaving out most of the information. So when I use my quirk, it not only hurts like hell, but slowly kills my body the whole time. So you're trying to learn to use it without damaging yourself, to be a hero? Izuku asked, his tone picking up with excitement even as the nurse kept his heart rate steady. Toya let out a throaty cold laugh at Izuku's enthusiasm behind the question. You sound like my little brother with all the hero talk. You two would probably get along if you ever met, Toya said, rising from his seat, completely ignoring Izuku's question and walking back to his room. Izuku took his lack of answer as determination for himself and put his full effort into controlling his quirk. To, at the very least, stay conscious while he was transformed. But no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much effort he put in, from the moment he transformed, he completely blacked out. But no matter how many times he tried, no progress was made. Every test was the same. Enter reinforced room, transform and lose control. Scar gets knocked out by knockout gas that kept rising in potency each time he was called in. Until, shortly after Izuku's 7th birthday, just over 2 years since he had first awakened his quirk, change came. Not in Izuku but to the facility as a whole. Izuku was resting in his room after another Scar test when the explosion shook the building. Instantly Nurse Enzu was by his side, calming his heartbeat before it was too late and he began to transform. Even as the staff did their best to keep the patients away from the blue flames that ravaged half the building, that couldn't stop them from speculating what had happened. And it was Izuku who knew. It had only been a week ago when he had convinced Toya to finally show him his quirk. The heat he had felt at seeing the powerful blue fire Toya held carefully in his hands as he smirked at Izuku's fascination with his quirk. Izuku had been happy. He finally got to see Toya's awesome quirk, until Toya was handed a letter. Izuku watched Toya's face fall into sadness, anger, and finally acceptance before he burned the letter with his fire. His face set in an expression Izuku didn't recognize on the apathetic older boy. That had been a week ago, and Izuku hadn't seen or heard anything about Toya until this. Toya, he muttered as he watched the blue fire spread as more people were evacuated from the burning building. Sue, you know what happened, care to spill? A cheerful voice from behind him cut off Izuku's inner rant as he felt someone jump onto his back, their voice tickling his ear. Izuku had a moment of panic and Nurse Enzu once again kept his quirk down with her own. That's enough, Toga. We won't get any answers if you give him a heart attack, a second more serious said, causing the owner of the first voice to jump off of Izuku's back with a pouty groan. Now that he was free to move again, Izuku turned to face the two voices. The first was a boy with a bird's head. Black feathers like a crow's spiked backwards and a yellow beak dominated his face, although his hands were perfectly normal. He was a little shorter and thinner than Izuku, but he was clearly more confident standing his ground. The second voice, the one that jumped on his back, was a girl with cat-like features. Izuku could see her yellow slitted eyes gleaming with mischief and her wide grin showed off her large pointed incisors. Her messy sandy blonde hair was held in a short Heim cut. Both seemed to be his age, and both had hospital wristbands like Izuku's own, marking them as patients like him. Sue, the girl repeated, poking Izuku's shoulder, likely hoping it would get her an answer sooner. The blue fire. My designated older sibling Toya's quirk was blue fire, Izuku said softly, the shock of seeing Toya's quirk out of control like this finally fading as the implications settled in. Toya had always said even using his quirk hurt him. If that was true, just how much damage did Toya do to himself to create this firestorm? I see, it wouldn't be the first time a patient has lost control, but this is to a scale I thought impossible. The bird boy said, his voice even despite the circumstances. I'm Himiko Toga, the cutest person in the whole hospital, and you might be second. The girl greeted Izuku, her fanged smile seeming to widen at his discomfort even as she stuck out her hand to him. Izuku Midoriya, he said quietly, somewhat put off by Himiko's forwardness, his lack of experience talking to people and nerves shining through. Forgive her, her quirk means she isn't quite all there sometimes. I am Fumikage Tokoyami. Unlike the overexcited girl, Fumicage's personality was much more toned down. Ah, don't mind Fumi. He gets a bit grumpy when his schedule changes. Izuku was thrown off as a bird-shaped shadow emerged from Fumicage's stomach and spoke to the green-haired boy. And this is my troublesome quirk, Dark Shadow. Fumicage continued, ignoring the protests from the shadow. He doesn't seem too bad, Izuku said carefully, watching with fascination as the shadow turned and acted autonomously from Fumicage. I know, right? I'm an angel, the shadow agreed with Izuku. Until it gets dark and you start trying to eat people, Fumicage countered, glaring at the shadow until it retreated into his chest. Well, that escalated quickly. And I drink sweet, sweet blood and turn into different people. It's so much fun. Himiko chimed in, pulling Fumikage into her side with a cheer. It also gives you a disproportionate fascination with blood. Fumikage added in a bored voice, clearly used to Himiko's antics. What about you? What makes you go tick-tick-boom? Himiko asked Izuku, ignoring Fumikage as he extracted himself out from under her arm. I kinda sorta lose control and turn into an enormous green rage monster, Izuku admitted, rubbing the back of his awkwardly, retreating into himself slightly. The only thing keeping himself calm at this point was the presence of Nurse Anzu behind him, ensuring Scar was locked away. Izuku shuffled awkwardly for a moment, becoming increasingly aware of the chaos going on around the three children as emergency responders and heroes came and went from the building. Before the silence could grow to the point of being awkward, Himiko's smile widened, if that was even possible, before she responded. You know what, Freckles? I think we'll get along just fine. A grunt and nod from Fumikage lifted Izuku's spirits as he looked at the duo. It seemed like, for the first time in a long time, he had friends. All Might POV. It had been a few years, but Toshinori Yagi hadn't forgotten about his old friend's son. After the recent fire from another patient's out-of-control quirk, he figured he had waited long enough. Almost a month after the fire, he made an appointment with the hospital to see if Izuku could control Scar with a live target present. All Might watched as Izuku was led into the heavily reinforced room and had the situation explained to him. All Might watched as Izuku's expression went from interested, to worry, to pure awe as he stared at All Might's muscular form grinning at him from across the room. When you are ready, young Midoriya, I will only defend myself if you cannot control Scar, but have no fear, I can most assuredly handle him. All Might told the boy, subconsciously setting his feet in a ready position as Izuku took a deep breath and held it. Izuku's skin rippled as he grew before All Might's eyes. Like Izuku, Scar had grown over the years. Compared to Izuku's natural lanky 4-foot frame, Scar towered over that at almost 6 feet of pure muscle, but still shorter than All Might's own 7+1. From the footage All Might had seen, he had originally assumed that Scar's skin was a gray-green, but he could now see that, while one might see shades of gray, Scar was a pale olive green. His hair was long and hung loosely past his neck as a simple flex of his muscles shredded the shirt Izuku had been wearing. That was the only warning All Might got before Scar launched himself forward at All Might, letting loose a berserker yell as he tried to deck the number 1 hero in the face. All Might was more than capable of ducking under the wild blow and landing a few soft strikes of his own into Scar's chest and gut. Soft as in they didn't break any bones. The green berserker was still sent flying across the room. Control it, young Midoriya. Try and at least direct Scar as he strikes. All Might tried to get through to Izuku as Scar rose and charged again. It was all for naught though as Scar continued his blind assault on All Might, who used increasingly stronger and stronger blows to fend him off. After almost 20 minutes had passed, All Might decided to call it quits. It was clear Izuku wasn't making any kind of progress controlling what the hospital referred to as his manifested ID. Shooting forward much faster than he had been moving earlier, All Might landed a knockout punch into Scar's stomach, causing him to hunch over onto all fours. Surprisingly, Scar managed to stay conscious for a moment as he looked up and glared up at All Might, his green eyes shining with rage. Next time, Blondie. Scar's voice was deep and gruttle, clearly not often used for much more than raging yells. But the fact that Scar could talk, string together words in a manner that made sense was a shock for most of the doctors as they rushed into the room to check on Izuku as Scar's muscular form faded into the 7-year-old child. All Might wasn't nearly as shocked. Once again, Izuku's quirk proved to be very similar to his father's. Scar wasn't some manifestation of his ID and anything like that. Scar was his own person, one with his own goals and strengths. A sentient quirk, the most troublesome kind of quirk. Well, that was progress, the lead doctor said to All Might as the two watched Izuku get carried out of the room. Yes, and hopefully the understanding that Scar is sentient, not an ID, will help him control him eventually. All Might agreed. I know you are very busy as the number 1 hero, but would you mind coming in the future, All Might? The doctor asked as the duo left the room. I have a feeling Scar will only work with us, with Izuku if he can fight. It seems to be his only purpose right now. And you are one of the few heroes who I can think of that can outmatch Scar physically. I'd be happy to. Young Midoriya wants to be a hero, and if he can learn to control Scar, then he'll grow to be a damn fine hero. All Might agreed before heading out of the Quirk Hospital. What he didn't say was he was concerned. He had to use 50% of one for all to keep consistently with Scar, and the only reason that wasn't higher was because all Scar did was blindly charge. That kind of power drew interest, and while only the government knew about it at this point, that wouldn't last. Leaks existed, and eventually he would hear about where Izuku was kept, if he didn't know already. He would come, and All Might wasn't going to let him get his hands on young Midoriya's quirk. After Toya's explosion and the discovery that Scar was his own being trapped within Izuku's mind, his whole routine within the Quirk Hospital was changed. Instead of being kept away from other patients like he had been, he was encouraged to build his own personality up, build bonds with the others around him. He even started having conversations with Nurse Enzu, who was a rather pleasant individual now that she wasn't being told to only be around Izuku to suppress the activation of his quirk. His quirk testing sessions had also changed. Instead of just letting Scar out to try and control him, All Might was now present to try and interact with Scar and get the other half of Izuku to open up. So far there were limited results. Scar certainly responded to All Might, but it came in the form of kicks, punches, and if he could ever get a weapon, stabs. All Might took care of Scar easily enough, but there wasn't much progress in the whole open up thing. The only other development in Izuku's quirk was that it was discovered that as Izuku got closer to turning into Scar, his physical body got tougher and he got stronger. A minor boost when compared to true heroes, but most heroes would fall if faced with Scar raging in their direction. But the biggest change to Izuku, not just in the hospital but in his life overall, was that, for the first time he had friends, real friends. Not like Katsuki, who Izuku now realized kept him around to feed his superiority complex, but real friends, people who would go to war for him and who he would unleash Scar for. Of course, he was talking about Fumikage Tokoyami and Himiko Toga, and sometimes Dark Shadow if he was behaving. Fumikage was the most serious of the trio, as well as the closest to finishing his rehab. His Dark Shadow's weakness was light, so keeping it under control was doable as long as he kept an extremely bright flashlight on his person to shock Dark Shadow back under control if he got any ideas. The final stage of his rehab was putting in the work to control Dark Shadow if there was no light source to subdue him with. It was hard work, but Fumikage had shared with the others that he was making progress. Himiko was the wild child of the trio. She was the one who replaced all the toilet paper in the hospital with the doctor's paperwork, the one who set off the sprinkler system at least once a month for fun, and the one who had the most trouble controlling her quirk. Himiko's quirk was called Transform, which hid the true nature of the quirk. While she could transform into other people, she had to drink their blood to do it. While a harmless quirk on the surface, if off-putting because of the blood, Himiko's quirk also gave her an obsession with seeing blood, most specifically other people's blood. She had attacked another child on the playground as her quirk's desire overwhelmed her, so her parents shipped her here until she could control it. She usually worked with the pro-hero Vlad King, whose quirk let him control his own blood and survive even fatal blood loss. It was the only time when Himiko was allowed to see blood, her own or anyone else's. She was kept away from any sharp objects like Izuku was kept from letting his heart pick up. Izuku rounded out the trio with his wild enthusiasm for heroes and desire to control the power his quirk held. While Himiko and Fumikage only wanted to learn enough to be let out back to the real world, Izuku wanted to control every aspect of Scar. To use the Berserker to be a hero. It was inspiring to the duo that had been told their whole lives that their quirks were unsuited for heroism. The three were always hanging out together, whether it be pranking led by Toga, more peaceful activities like board games that Tokoyami insisted on, or watching heroes and analyzing everything they did, which was Izuku's obsession. That time spent together in rehab was the happiest Izuku had ever been. But it all came crashing down when good news came to Fumikage. Shortly after turning 10, the raven-headed boy finally had enough control over Dark Shadow to be released back into the world. It was a tearful goodbye for the trio, but as he left, Fumikage had a last piece of advice for Izuku. As much as you want to control Scar, he doesn't want you to control him, the same as Dark Shadow and I. Work with him, Izuku, he might surprise you. It wasn't long after that Izuku finally learned how to do something while Scar was in control. Scar was still very much the raging berserker, but Izuku's older mind had finally developed enough to exert the smallest amount of control over him. He could direct Scar, force him to target one thing over others. Of course, Scar wouldn't stop attacking, forcing Izuku to direct his anger into the ground when they ran out of targets and pretend villains. The only target Izuku couldn't direct Scar away from was All Might. Whenever the number one hero was around, Scar completely shut Izuku out and hyper-focused All Might of his own volition. From All Might's explanation, it was a trait similar to his father's Hulk. The desire to be the strongest by beating the strongest. To be the strongest alive. But it was a step forward, it was control. And it meant that Izuku's goal of using Scar to be a hero was just that much closer. And it was that realization combined with Fumicage's leaving that hurt Himiko. It was after another successful training session that Izuku found his best friend curled up in the corner of her room, hugging her pillow with her knees pulled up to her chest, silent tears falling from her eyes. Izuku was quick to sit beside her and throw his arm over her shoulder. After all the times Himiko had glomped him, he had long since overcome his nerves around the opposite gender. He didn't ask her why and say anything. He just let Himiko open up to him. How can you do it, Aizu? You are getting more and more control over Scar and Fumi already is back in the world. But here I am, making absolutely no progress whatsoever. Himiko finally said after a long wait. Long enough that Nurse and Zu had left the two of them to their privacy. It was a question that Izuku hesitated to answer, his quirk knowledge working at a fast pace as he considered sharing what he was almost certain was Himiko's answer. It was several minutes of silence before Izuku finally answered, mentally going over his calming exercises. I think you are doing everything you can, Himiko. It's not that you are doing anything wrong, but that you're working towards the wrong goal. You need blood to use your quirk, other people's blood. To never want blood, like the doctors are trying to get you to do, means you have to never want to use your quirk. But you want to be a hero, just like I do and just like Fumi does. You want to use your quirk, but everything they are telling you here goes against that. It's hurting you a lot more than it's helping you. I don't know what it is you need, Himiko, but I know that if you want to be a hero, you are going to have to use your quirk, and that's not something the doctors want. Izuku responded, watching Himiko's reaction carefully. It was a conclusion he had come to after watching various doctors work with him, and hearing about what treatments Fumicage and Himiko got. It was an ugly truth, but it was one Izuku had come to accept. Quirks that had power were valued much higher than other quirks. It was why everyone had praised Katsuki when they were children. It was why Endeavor got away with massive amounts of property damage when he fought, and it was why he and Fumicage had received so much help and freedom when working to control their quirks. Compared to them, Himiko was being shoved aside. Instead of learning to use her quirk, she was being forced to suppress everything about it. And it was hurting her. As time passed, she was smiling less, pranking less, and spent more and more time staring at people's wrists, the place that bled the most when cut. She was torn between wanting to use her quirk to be a hero and being taught to reject her quirk, and it was driving her towards a psychotic break. And that wasn't something Izuku was going to let happen. He remembered what happened to Toya. He had seen the older boy shut himself away slowly until he finally snapped and exploded in a blue blaze. Himiko was his best friend, closer than the more reserved Fumicage, and actually cared about him unlike Katsuki had. Even if it would get him into trouble, he would do his best to do what he thought would help his friend. Even if it meant breaking rules. After all, wasn't it a hero's job to butt in when they weren't wanted? While Himiko was digesting Izuku's words, he quickly raised his hand to his mouth and bit his thumb hard enough to draw blood. Himiko froze when she saw her best friend's precious blood spilt in front of her, glistening droplets resting on his thumb. It took all the self-control she had been taught by the doctors to not jump on Izuku's hand to get the blood she had been denied for years. Drink it, Himi, your quirk is a part of you, not something you reject. Scar is a part of me, Dark Shadow is a part of Fumicage, and your quirk is on your blood. You can be a hero with your quirks, even if some people might tell you otherwise. You are strong enough to not hurt innocent people because you want their blood, and you will be strong enough to fight the bad guys for those people who might look down on you because of your quirk. Izuku's words were enough to break through Himiko's resolve, and she quickly has his thumb in her mouth. sucking whatever blood she could get for the first time since she had entered the Quirk hospital years ago. She looked up at Izuku's small smile with big eyes, her thirst for blood sated for the first time in years, and by her best friend, a boy who had just as much of a struggle with his own quirk as she did, taking the time to do anything he could to help her, to be her hero. In that moment, Himiko knew Izuku would be a hero, no matter what anyone said. It was just who he was. Someone who would help others even at the price of himself. Something she knew was very similar to what she had seen of All Might on TV. That was what it meant to be a hero, she realized. Helping others, doing what was right, even if there were consequences. She knew Izuku would get into a lot of trouble if he was caught giving her blood. But he did it anyway because he thought it was what was best for her. And he was right. Already Himiko could feel the intense desire for blood ebbing away from her mind, allowing her to think more clearly than she had in a long time. After detaching from Izuku's finger, Himiko gave him a big smile. Not one of the goofy ones she shared after a prank, but a genuine smile. A smile that Izuku sent back at her when he saw her. "Better?" Izuku asked, a touch of nerves he usually wasn't allowed to have coloring his voice. "Yeah. Thanks Izu, you're my hero," Himiko said, her large smile turning into a large smirk as she pressed a light kiss to Izuku's cheek, turning his face bright red and sending him into a muttering mess. But for the first time in years, Nurse Enzu wasn't there to suppress what came next. With his heart rate spiking and his mind not focused on calming it again, Scar made his first unscheduled appearance in years. Himiko was shocked as her best friend seemed to twitch before expanding in size. His muscles ripping out of his hospital shirt and his pants barely stretching enough to stay on him. His green hair growing longer, darker, and losing its natural fluffiness as it fell down his back. Nurses and doctors rushed in to try and stop Scar from running free as the alert bracelet Izuku wore tore off his expanding wrist. But they were too late. As they entered the room, they came face to face with the fully awakened berserker, who was sitting on the ground watching them as Himiko sat beside him in awe. Scar was like nothing the young girl had ever seen. He had the same powerful presence she imagined All Might would have, but it was wilder, an edge of something assaulting her senses. It didn't feel dangerous to her, but she could tell others might not feel the same. It was with a fluid motion that the seated Scar swept up Himiko with a single muscular arm and plopped her onto his shoulders where she held into his head and wrapped her legs around the back of his neck to keep from falling. Himiko was surprised to learn that even as Scar, Izuku's hair was just as soft as it usually was. The doctors were panicked as they kept trying to convince Himiko to get away from Scar, calling him a wild animal, but Himiko didn't think so. She could tell Izuku was in Scar, and that neither of them would hurt her. He was her hero no matter what form he was in, and she let the doctors know just that. "Calm down, you babies, he's friendly, see, he's my hero," she told them with a bright smile on her face as she remained seated on Scar's shoulders, running his fingers through Scar's long hair, absently braiding it in a loose braid. The doctor's protests halted at Himiko's words and Scar grunted light underneath her, his deep voice speaking out only two words. "Mine, protect," was all Scar said. His voice more of a grunt than anything, but his message was clear. He would not be harming Himiko, nor would he allow other to do so. The doctors watched in shock as Himiko used the olive-green berserker as a jungle gym for the next hour before Scar grunted again and faded back to Izuku, who was understandably panicked when he realized he had transformed into Scar. The whole hospital was there to drag Izuku away from Himiko, both to tears as they were forced away from their best friend. It was the next day that they got the news. Izuku was no longer allowed to see Himiko, because Scar was a threat to others when around her apparently. Now, almost 11 years old, for the first time since Toya had died and left him alone when he was 7, Izuku was alone again. What was worse was knowing that Himiko was also alone, that he was powerless to help his best friend, despite all the strength that Scar held. It only took a week for that isolation to end, by Himiko breaking into Izuku's room in the middle of the night. When he awoke to see his best friend, Izuku was thrilled to see his friend again, until he saw the backpack she wore on her back and the street clothes she wore. It was then he knew he wouldn't be seeing her after this for a long time. "You're leaving, right?" Izuku asked as Himiko wrapped him in a tight hug as they sat on the edge of Izuku's bed. only the moon shining through the window providing light on the duo. You were right, Izu. They don't want to help me here, Himiko admitted. But I'm going to be a hero, just like you are and just like Scar will be, she said, steel in her voice instead of her usual playfulness. Would a hero academy accept you after running from here? Wouldn't they just send you back? Izuku asked, already knowing what Himiko would answer. That's why I'm not going to be a normal hero. Vigilantes are rare now, but they're still around. I'm going to help people, Izu, even if it hurts me. You inspired that in me, and that's what I'm going to do. Himiko was insistent, and Izuku only nodded in response. Even if he didn't think it was a very good idea, he would support and help his best friend. Grabbing one of the test tubes from the counter in his room, Izuku cut the palm of his hand on one of his bed springs and filled the vial, Himiko watching with subdued awe. Corking the vial, Izuku took Himiko's hand and pressed the vial into it. If that's what you want, then do it. Be a hero. And as long as you are trying to be a hero, I'll help you as much as I can, no matter what you need, Izuku told Himiko, his eyes showing how much determination he had. Himiko could only nod. Both children's eyes began to water as they realized this was where their paths separated for the time being. The world was a cruel place for those whose quirks weren't well received by others. They were forced to face the cold truths of the world much sooner than others. It wasn't fair, but both of them would keep moving forward. They would become heroes. Himiko, blushing lightly, pressed a light kiss onto Izuku's lips before jumping out the window and vanishing into the night. For once, Izuku's flustered state didn't lead to Scar coming out, his sadness overwhelming his usually trigger nerves. Alone, that was what he was now. No Toya, no Fumikage, and no Himiko. But he still had his dream. He was going to be a hero, he was going to work with Scar, and he even had All Might to help him. Little did Izuku know that across the country, All Might was battling for his life against his greatest enemy, and that once it was over, everything would begin on the path of change. All Might POV. The stomach, Toshinori Yagi decided, was a much more important organ than he ever gave it credit for. Realizing this now, after most of his own was torn from his chest, along with bits of his liver, large intestine, and left lung, was not exactly the best time to have this realization. He also had the fleeting wish that All for One had targeted less important organs like his gallbladder or maybe his appendix. His musings aside, he waited as patiently as he could in his hospital for Recovery Girl to deliver the final verdict. Based on how he was feeling and the sheer amount of stitches he had on his chest, he already knew this wasn't something that he was just going to recover from. You've done it this time, Toshinori. Gone and really messed yourself up something nasty. Gran Torino's angry voice sent a shiver down his spine. An angry Torino was not a Torino he ever wanted to face, much less when he couldn't run away. Before he could defend himself, a second voice came from the entryway, cutting him off. He's right, you know, Recovery Girl added, entering the room behind his mentor. Although given the circumstances, I suppose it was the best we could hope for. Exactly, see Gran Torino, it was All for One, and now he's dead. I avenged Nana, so everything will be All Might. Toshinori piped in, puffing up into his full All Might form from his normal muscular stature. Almost instantly, he could feel something was wrong. His stitches tore slightly and he could feel liquid rising in his throat. With a bloody hacking cough, he was forced to return to his original form, Recovery Girl already at his side pressing fresh bandages into his reopened wounds. What I was going to tell you, you great oaf, was that shifting between you normal and hero forms shifts your organs that are currently a complete mess. And even if you were to wait until the scar tissue completely formed, you would still be damaging yourself every time you shift because your body is trying to arrange and expand your organs in a set pattern, a pattern that doesn't account for damage like this. Recovery Girl's voice got steadily louder as she berated the number one hero who was busy trying to keep himself from choking on his own blood. You got two choices, Toshi. Neither of them get you back to 100%. Gran Torino as All Might finally felt the blood rising in his throat. You either have to take the next few months off for scar tissue to form and we can get a baseline for your injuries and see if there is something we can do about the damage, a transplant or something similar, or we can operate now before the full tissue forms, which will put you on your feet in a few weeks. but there might be side effects. I am already certain you won't be able to do as much for as long anymore. You finally fully broke your limits, brat. Gran Torino explained as his student took in the information. As much as All Might wanted to be back on his feet and helping people as soon as he could, he knew both his mentor and recovery girl would chain him to the bed and have Aizawa watch over him to make sure he couldn't escape. I'll wait and let the scar tissue form. All Might decided, getting nods from both older heroes, not that they were going to give him much of a choice. He could already feel the damage that activating one for all had caused on his body. While he wasn't a small man by any means, Toshinori Yagi was not as large as All Might. The muscular form was something he had stumbled upon just before graduating from UA, and he was grateful for it, giving him a way to hide from hordes of fans and the press. He enjoyed working with people, but damn it, he needed time without them too. Rest well for now, Toshi. Nana would be proud of what you accomplished. And with that, Gran Torino left, All Might smiling softly at his mentor's back as he left. There would be consequences in the aftermath of his fight. The clock was on for him now. He always knew one day he would retire and pass down one for all, but it had always seemed so distant. Now that deadline was going to keep in his every waking thought until he found someone he felt fit the bill, someone who could take all the strength and become the next pillar. But those were thoughts for another day, Toshinori decided as he settled back into his hospital bed, faintly noticing several doctors re-entering his room to check on his stitches. For now, the number one hero would sleep in assurance of his victory. Elsewhere, hidden laboratory. It had taken most of Dr. Ujiko's considerable skill and a great many regenerative quirks to ensure All for One survived the damage All Might had dealt to his body. He did survive, miraculously enough, but he would never be the same. Regrowing the top half of his head from the pulp All Might reduced it to had been near impossible. Doing it completely correctly was never going to happen. Both his eyes and nose had improperly formed, making it impossible to see and very hard to breathe. But his brain was safely restored without lasting damage done. As he lay with tubes connected directly to his lungs, he pondered the future. After years of ruling over the underworld, his crime empire lay in ruins just as his body did. All Might had taken everything from him. His little brother's legacy had stripped him of almost everything he held dear. But there was still the future to plan for. He wasn't going to make a comeback from his injuries, not unless a godlike healing quirk stumbled into his lap, and even then, he would have to have the doctor cut away all the scar tissue that was rapidly forming over his many wounds. But while his time as the king of villains might be coming to a close, so too was All Might's time as the symbol of peace. He knew he had damaged the man greatly, probably not enough to kill him. The great brute was far too stubborn to die from something like a fist through the chest, but he was just as crippled as All for One was now. The two had maybe one big battle left in each of them before their bodies simply couldn't hold the power they contained any longer. And that was all there was to it. For All Might, that meant finding the next inheritor of his quirk. The next hero determined to end him, the next pain in his ass. The idea of a successor of his own had long stewed in All for One's mind. To pass his own quirk down to a student. But with his quirk, it just simply wasn't possible. No human except himself was built to handle as many quirks as he had acquired. Not even the few spawn he had produced over the years could hold more than a few quirks before their brains turned to mush. It had been years since he determined that despite the rapid evolution of humanity, the body could only handle so much. Even those with extremely adaptable bodies could only handle 3 quirks total. Their mind began to break down. All for One was the exception, allowing his body to adapt and hold as many quirks as he wanted. One for All was another exception. Instead of allowing the user to use the quirks stored within, it converted them into raw power for the user to apply in their own way. But the idea lingered despite his past dismissal of the concept. A successor, a villainous figure that stood above the rest. A soul that wanted nothing more than destruction for destruction's sake, backed by the power to crush his foes underfoot. Another chance to rule Japan without his greatest mistake running around yelling smash like that great green American brute. All for One felt his memory spark as he remembered a report the doctor had brought in years ago. The Hulk, the quirk strong enough to defeat All Might in his prime, had had a child, one with a similar quirk. A body adaptable and strong enough to handle any force thrown at it. His first thought had been to use Shimura's grandson as his successor. His warped view of the world fit his needs perfectly, but the prospect of twisting a destructive force like the Hulk, It would bypass his need to find a way for his successor to handle his quirk. Oh, the deliberation. Gesturing with his hand, All for One got a notepad from Dr. Ujiko and wrote his instructions for the man. Shimura Tenko, now Shigaraki Tamura, would be their plan for now, but he wasn't the optimal choice. Not that he'd ever catch wind of that until it was already over with. They couldn't be direct in their approach. All for One was far too weak now for heroes to actively be hunting him, but he could set things in motion. The last he had heard, the boy was in quirk therapy to try and control his quirk, to use his mind in the beast's body, and he was slowly making progress with All Might's help. But there would be no more All Might to help him. His failing body would ensure that, which meant the boy's progress would halt, and any interested party could pull him from under the nose of the brute. All it would take to get the ball rolling was a few messages sent to the right people. Old General Ross at the top of that list. The man had been hounding the Japanese government to get his hands on the child, and it would be much easier for All for One to slip him away from the looser system the Americans used. So Dr. Ujiko sped off, his instructions written out for him. By the end of that week, General Thunderbolt Ross was flying to Japan with a mission to acquire the spawn of the Hulk. United States Black Ops Facility location classified. Bruce Banner knew he was a great many things, and while those close to him called him a genius and a hero, he knew the truth. He was a fool, a hypocrite, and a failure as a father. He had cursed his only child, his son Izuku, with his quirk. He had cursed the world with a second unstoppable rage beast lurking just beneath the surface of a brilliant mind. When he was younger, Bruce had wanted to go into the sciences. He wanted to explore the world beyond quirks. His father, a small-time hero who had been forced out of the business by his lack of success, was less than encouraging of the idea. He had been extremely disappointed and angered when Bruce hadn't revealed a quirk even after he turned 4. In fact, Bruce himself wasn't aware that he had a quirk until he was 16. His mind far too focused on learning science and graduating from college early. The first thing to truly make Bruce Banner angry was coming home from his college classes to see his father finally cross the line. For years he tolerated the man's harsh attitude, taking the beltings and verbal abuse. He even knew that his father would occasionally turn his abusive hand on his wife, but Bruce just endured, his mother's soothing words keeping from hating his father. But coming home and seeing his father, standing over his bleeding mother, bloody knife in hand, had been too much for Bruce. Years of patience finally ended and anger, true anger, dominated the mind of Bruce Banner for the first time in his life. And with his first time becoming greatly angered came the first activation of his dormant quirk, and the Hulk broke almost an entire block of downtown before over a dozen heroes cornered him with suppressive fire from their quirks. After he woke up after transformation, life for Bruce was completely changed. Unlike other countries, the United States was far less forgiving of accidental quirk activations. And despite it being the first time his quirk had manifested, Bruce found himself on trial for killing his father with his quirk. It was General Ross who had swooped in and kept Bruce from ending up in a prison for the rest of his life. He had proposed that Bruce finish his schooling in a secure government location and then use his knowledge to research for the government. All the while, the resources around him kept the Hulk from killing again. It was as fair a deal as Bruce could ask for, and he accepted. But it was only a few months into that arrangement that the Hulk was seen again. A new villain had stepped up and publicly defeated every hero that tried to challenge him, going as far as to expose himself and crush any who opposed him. The abomination was more than the state's normal lineup could handle, so they turned to international help. Japan's rising star All Might, touted for his extreme strength, the government hoped he could defeat the monster of a villain. General Ross, however, put his own plan into action, stealing Bruce Banner from his lab and dropping him out of a helicopter in front of the abomination to force the Hulk to face off against the beast of a man. For only his second transformation, the Hulk fought tooth and nail against the villain. The brawl further devolved into a three-way slugfest when All Might showed up to intervene. The fight lasted several hours until the Hulk stood alone over his defeated foes, giving a single roar of victory before collapsing back into Bruce Banner's much smaller form. It was in the hospital after the fight that Bruce made his first friend in a great many years, in the form of the muscular Japanese man who fought both with and against the Hulk. It was also a day that Bruce created a new goal for himself to destroy his quirk. It had taken years of study and several more Ross-ordered deployments of the Hulk before Bruce finished his serum, one capable of destroying the part of his cells that triggered his transformation. After injecting himself, he passed the tests put forth by the government's doctors to show the Hulk was gone, much to Ross's great disappointment, and took his first vacation in years to visit his friend in Japan. The one thing he did not expect to happen on that trip was to fall in love and get married before he was forced back to the States, leaving his new wife behind. The shocking news that she was pregnant forced a new fear into Bruce Banner's mind. Would his child inherit his quirk? Had he just created a new Hulk? He had waited 4 years in suspense, taking every vacation he could to visit the bright-eyed green-haired child he called his own. And while it hurt his child and upset his wife, Bruce couldn't be happier that his child was confirmed as quirkless. That relief lasted a little less than 2 weeks before a news report came through that a green rage beast had shredded a park in Japan and had Ross loaded on the first flight he could to Tokyo. He had been relieved when his friend Toshinori had called to assure him that Ross wouldn't get his hands on his son, that Toshinori would teach him to control his quirk the way Bruce never had. Ross coming home fuming mad was one of Bruce's favorite memories. And he had left it at that, letting Toshinori work with his son, never reaching out once to his own child, whose whole world was probably just rocked by his quirk's awakening, and realizing just who exactly his father was. It was cold of him, but it gave him peace of mind that everything would work out. And now, going through Ross's emails after the man had once again left in a hurry for Tokyo. All Might was injured, his friend had been crippled, and Ross was going to use that to try and get his hands on Izuku once again, to turn his son that wanted nothing more than to be a hero into a weapon. For the first time in years, Bruce Banner felt the stirrings of the Hulk within him, and for once he didn't disagree with him. He would do whatever it took to help his son, as he should have done years ago. Pulling up a fresh browser, Bruce copied a series of files from his computer into the email before sending it off to Toshinori with a quick note. The injured hero could handle it from there. With a deep breath, Bruce pushed away from his laptop, removed his glasses, and made his way to the freight elevator at the back of his rather expansive lab. Once he had reached the reinforced panic room, Bruce took a meditative seat and, for the first time in his life, reached out to the beast within him. He had let Izuku down. He had been kept away from his son for years. He wouldn't even know what his son looked like if it wasn't for Toshinori. That ended now. It might be years before he could see his son in the flesh again, but he could do his best to make sure he could become a hero if that was still his goal. And while Izuku had made progress working with All Might, that was going to be halted now. So it was his turn now. Izuku and he had the same quirk, the same strengths and weaknesses. And while he might have destroyed his body capability to turn into the Hulk, the beast was still there, lurking within the back of his mind. And for the first time in years, Bruce Banner's glowed a powerful green, filled with determination to make up for his past mistakes. Quirk Hospital. Inko Midoriya knew a lot of things. She knew she probably wouldn't be allowed to see her husband again unless she flew out to the States. She knew who he was and exactly why he was considered one of the most dangerous men on the planet. She knew that there would be trouble when Izuku had first transformed, showing the same powerful quirk as his father. She knew that despite that, she would support her son every step of the way, and that Bruce would do what he could from the States. But above all else, Inko Midoriya knew that the two most important people in her life only wanted to help people, either as a hero or a scientist. That they were the two people she trusted most to have such destructive and violent quirks, to keep the raging beasts under control. It was that trust that made the decision in front of her so easy. The news that All Might, the only hero who had been able to help Izuku learn to better direct and control Scar, had been dealt a near-crippling injury. That she had met All Might many times before, in his civilian face of Toshinori Yagi, an old friend of her husband's. That he would no longer be physically capable of helping Izuku learn to control Scar. And that General Ross, that same man that held her husband prisoner, was on his way to take her son. It was shocking. Inko was a simple woman, not cut out for dealing with multiple military agents and problems involving the #1 hero. But this involved her son, so she was prepared to do what she had to. That was how she found herself meeting with the head of the Quirk Hospital alongside Toshinori, who was acting as All Might's agent. I understand the head doctor of the rehab center said with a sigh after Tashinori shared the news of All Might's inability to continue working with Izuku. It certainly explains why he hasn't been around to work with him this past month. Disappearing like he did had Izuku quite worried. Tashinori gave a nod at that and Inko refocused the conversation. So what are the options for Izuku now? Are there other available heroes who would be able to continue working with Izuku here? Or was All Might the only one? Inko already knew the answer to her own question, but she had to ask. Scar has already developed a resistance to Midnight's quirk and other suppressing drugs that we might use. Its immune system is truly incredible. That said, without All Might, we can only prevent Scar from coming out, not stopping it. Nurse Enzu has spent a great deal of time with Izuku, but she is due to transfer next month. So even our ability to prevent Scar from appearing will be cut short. I know the hero Eraserhead also has the ability to prevent Izuku from transforming, but asking a hero to spend all their time containing a single quirk would be too much to ask, wouldn't it? Inko asked, mentally going over the options Tashinori had discussed with her on the drive over. She didn't like them, any of them. She already knew which one Izuku would pick, but as the responsible adult, it came down to her decision. Yes, while Eraserhead has occasionally checked in on young Izuku, he already splits his time between his hero work and working as a teacher for UA. He is far too busy to spend as much time with Izuku as he needs. Tashinori added in, knowing what the doctor would say next. As unfortunate as it is, without All Might, Izuku will be unable to further his control over his quirk here, which means he will have to be discharged to a facility that is capable of helping him. I recall a note in his file that an American general had offered to help when he was first admitted. Would you like for me to start writing up the paperwork for a transfer? The doctor was just as quick to jump on the idea as Tashinori expected, clearly willing to hand Izuku over to Ross without a second thought. That was option 1, let Izuku be taken by Ross, and potentially get to work with his father. But that also put him under Ross's command, and after seeing how the man treated her husband, Inko would fight tooth and nail to keep the general's grubby mitts off her child. Thank you for the offer, but we have an alternate plan. Tashinori started, giving Inko a side glance and taking her nod as her acceptance to move forward with her choice. Option 2 was to use the same drug Bruce had used on himself on Izuku, physically preventing his cells from transforming him into Scar. It would be risky. Despite how similar the quirks were, Scar was different from the Hulk and might react differently to the drug. There was also the fact that Inko would be forcing Izuku to become quirkless. He was only quirkless for a short time, but Inko had failed to believe in her son then. She had apologized when he asked for reassurance. She didn't believe in his dream. She had learned from her mistake. She had seen the pain in Izuku's eyes when she had indirectly told him she didn't believe he could be a hero. She was going to put her trust in Izuku, give him any chance she could to become the hero he had always dreamed of becoming. Young Midoriya's father has a very similar quirk, and while he sought to learn how to control his quirk, he developed a drug that enforced the heartbeat to stay at a steady pace, preventing the quirk from activating. Tashinori said, pulling out one of the formulas Bruce had sent him, handing it to the doctor. It isn't without downsides, of course. The slowing agents within the drug are expensive, but All Might's hero agency is more than happy to foot the bill. All Might has expressed the desire to see young Midoriya grow as a hero, and will help him indirectly even if he is unable to help directly. Tashinori continued as the doctor looked over the papers in his hands. I see. This would allow for Izuku to go back to everyday life, although I am slightly worried about the side effects and the dosage size, the doctor said, handing the papers back to Tashinori. Those are valid concerns, but not ones without answers. The side effects for slowing down the heart include slowing down both mental processes and general reaction time. To put it simply, it will be like Izuku is high the whole time while on the drug. While this will make life harder for him day to day, it is simply the price to pay for containing his quirk while he lacks control. Tashinori said, watching as the doctor nodded along, Inko sitting still as a statue beside him. As for the dosage issue, while it is true that Scar has shown the tremendous ability to build resistances to various drugs, only a fraction of that resistance is transferred over to Izuku. So while he will need larger doses over the years, it will be decades before it grows too large for him to handle. Tashinori explained as the doctor sat across from him, watching the larger man as he explained. So that is your choice then, Mrs. Midoriya. Condemn your son to a half-life to control his quirk? The doctor asked, an edge of hardness to his voice. No, Inko responded, her own gaze hardening at the man who had clearly been paid by Ross to get Izuku into his hands. The drug will only be necessary while Izuku lacks control of his quirk. All Might negotiated a deal with the Japanese government for Izuku, that if Izuku is able to pass the UA entrance exam for the hero course, he would be able to stop taking the drug, as he would then have access to more resources to work on his control, as well have already demonstrated that he can control his quirk to an acceptable degree. Inko laid a different set of papers in front of the doctor, ones that detailed the deal Toshinori had brokered for her son, a deal that wouldn't have been possible without Bruce providing the formula for the calming drug. This was option 3. It would be hard for him, but Izuku could do it. She believed in the hero her son would become, and she would give him the chance, no matter how hard it would be, to prove it. All right then, the doctor said, clearly knowing when he was beaten. I'll pass the formula on to the scientists and we can get it ready for Izuku. All I ask is that we test it for a week here before he is discharged. The doctor said, getting nods from both Toshinori and Inko, signaling the end of the meeting. Both Inko and Toshinori got up and went their separate ways. Inko to explain what came next to her son, and Toshinori to meet a certain general at the airport and make sure he got right back on his plane. Tokyo Airport. General Ross was a goal-oriented person. Once he set his goal, it would take an act of God to move him from it. And right now, his goal was acquiring the child of the Hulk after the original had gone and made himself mostly useless to Ross. Holding him in the labs was an act of spite at this point. Every scientist he went to told him the same thing. Banner had managed to lock his quirk away permanently. So the second he heard the child that had been kept from him in Japan was unable to continue working to control the beast, he pounced. Japan just didn't have the resources of the States, despite having the #1 global hero in All Might. When it came to detaining powerful quirks, the US led the world. Ross had already prepared the boy's housing, a nice steel bunker underneath a mountain, where even if he lost control, he still couldn't get out. And with how young the boy was, Ross could train him to be loyal instead of resentful like his father. A perfect soldier, a perfect weapon. So when he was greeted as he got off the plane by all of Japan's top 10 heroes, All Might leading them, he was forced to pause. That pause then turned into worry when he noticed that All Might lacked his usual smile, the world's most powerful man's face set in a grim line. General Ross, you are overstepping your position. Please return to your plane and go home, All Might told him, his face never wavering from its stony visage. I'm not sure I understand you, All Might. My reason for being here is well within my jurisdiction. Ross tried to soothe the hero, but he was forced into silence by the large man's glare. You are here for custody of Izuku Midoriya, under the pretense that you can help him control his quirk where Japan can't. Not only are you incorrect, you have no right to young Midoriya. Don't bother protesting that his father is an American citizen, because young Midoriya is not an American citizen. He doesn't even have dual citizenship. So if you were to try and take him, you would be abducting a Japanese citizen without just cause or permission from the Japanese government, and a child with a powerful quirk at that. Some could misinterpret that as an act of war, General. So I say again, there is nothing for you here, Ross. Go home. By the time All Might was done, Ross was fuming. He had been assured that he would be able to simply walk in and claim the child. That All Might had recently been injured and would be unable to stop him again. Now he was staring down 10 individuals that could individually crush what little forces he had brought with him if he tried to continue onwards. This isn't over, All Might. Ross ground out, trying not to let his fear of an angry #1 hero show as he turned on his heel and boarded his plane not 5 minutes after he got off it. Looking back over his shoulder, he could see All Might continue watching him, eyes never leaving the general's retreating form. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. While he might have been denied the son, he still had the father. And while Bruce Banner might not be able to turn into the rage beast himself, the secret to his quirk was somewhere within him. He had been reluctant to do so before, but now he had no choice. Dr. Stearns would have his patient. Aldera Middle School. Katsuki Bakugo knew he wasn't the greatest in the world. It didn't matter how many people kissed the ground he walked on, how powerful his quirk was, how fast his reflexes, or even his above-average intelligence. None of that mattered, not to a boy who vividly remembered waking up in a hospital bed, both arms in casts, one leg in a floating cast, and a shell of bandages around his torso. He remembered his mother crying at his broken form, the miracle it took to put his body back together in perfect condition. And he remembered the cause of it. The scared little boy who had grown in front of his eyes into a raging monster, one that crushed his arms in its hands and then swatted him away like a fly as it turned to his two lackeys. Deku, the quirkless scrub that wasn't even supposed to be a pebble on his path to the #1 hero. The boy too scared to stand up for himself. Those eyes that changed from shivering fear to unstoppable rage in a matter of moments as a quirk that neither of them knew existed activated for the first time. It only took a quick internet search once. He could use his hands again to find out where Izuku got his power from. The American destroyer, the Hulk. The only one to ever beat All Might in a straight fight. And based on the quirk similarities, probably Izuku's father. Power that could beat All Might, all trapped inside the wimpy form of Deku. It was a waste, but it was also a goal. All his life Katsuki was told he was the best, the future #1. It was his own goal as well as others' expectations for him. Until that day it had seemed like a sure thing. He would grow and improve, and at the end of it all, he would stand as the undisputed and unbeatable #1, just like All Might. Now he knew things weren't going to go that smoothly. If Deku, a boy he had written off as useless and a waste of time, could almost cripple him, who else could surprise him? Were there others like him spread across Japan just waiting for their shot at the #1 spot, each one not realizing they were only big fish in small ponds when the world was the ocean? Deku and his rampaging quirk had opened Katsuki's eyes. If he wanted to be #1, he had to work for it, and never stop preparing for the monster he was unaware of. Deku was a lot more than a pebble in his path, and Katsuki knew there would be more like him out there. But he would crush each and every one of them to reach the #1 spot. And didn't that sound like a lot more fun than just walking up to the throne and taking a seat? Life was going well for Katsuki Bakugo. He was preparing for whatever pebbles would find themselves in his path. So imagine his surprise when halfway through his second to last year before junior high, Sensei had announced a new classmate. I'm not sure if anyone remembers him, but after almost 6 years of quirk rehabilitation, we have a student rejoining our class. Please welcome back, Midoriya Izuku. Katsuki had almost choked on his own spit as Deku entered the room, hands in his pockets and bag casually thrown over one shoulder. Deku was finally back, and if he had been released from quirk rehab, then he could control the rage machine that had put him in the hospital in seconds. He would have the strongest quirk in the class instead of Bakugo, and he probably wouldn't shut up about becoming a hero. Hello everyone, I'm Bacharach. Izuku spoke slowly, his form sagging slightly as he spoke. He made a clumsy bow before making his way to an open desk and almost collapsing in it. The entire lesson, Katsuki couldn't focus on what Sensei was saying. Far too busy glancing over at Izuku to pay attention to math he had already learned ahead of time. What he had originally mistaken for calm confidence was actually a detachment from reality. The just barely put together look wasn't Deku trying to be cool, it was him actually being barely put together. Deku could barely keep himself from slumping over on his desk. His eyes were glassy and prone to staring off into space rather than paying attention. Whenever he spoke, it was like he was trying to take as long as possible, making sure each word came out just right and often making the vowels over-enunciated. The annoying muttering Deku had made his habit was certainly a thing of the past. All put together, Deku looked and acted like he was high, very, very high. It was at recess when Katsuki finally managed to corner the green boy. The lack of surprise on his muted features told Katsuki he was expected. What's with the dopey look, Deku? Thought you'd be over the moon about having your quirk under control and be off in Mumble City. Not sitting on the sideline like a damn extra. Katsuki asked in his gruff manner, taking note of how it seemed to take several seconds for Deku to process the question, and several more for him to come up with a reply. Knew it exactly, Ka-chakan. Deku managed to get out, his voice still making him sound like he was about to fall asleep, each elongated word like a yawn. The hero I was working with had to stop, because he was injured, and since there was no one who could work with me, except him, I had to leave the Senior. Since I can't control my quirk, I have to take a calming drug. Susu it won't activate in the first play Aowace. Once Katsuki put together what Deku was saying, he had to hold back a laugh. Of course, Deku hadn't been able to get a hold of his quirk. No matter how powerful his quirk was, he was still just Deku. Even with a pro hero helping him, he wasn't able to do it. While Katsuki would always fear the quirk that had beaten him in seconds, he wouldn't fear Deku. Because nothing had changed, even with a quirk, he was still nothing, he was still Deku. If it had been someone more capable, someone like him with the Berserker quirk, then he might have to be worried. But it was just Deku, and he was nothing but a pebble in Katsuki's path, and it was long overdue reminding him of that. Well then, Deku, allow me to be the first one to welcome you back to school, Bakugo said with a wicked smile growing across his face, his palms crackling as his sweat ignited in a series of firecracker-like explosions. Izuku said nothing as Bakugo gave him his welcome back beating, said nothing as he had the whole school deriding him by the end of the day, spreading the word of his inability to control, and how it was locked away. Katsuki Bakugo went home that night with a vicious smile on his face. He was going to be the #1 hero, and he had just finished leaping over the first pebble in his path. Deku wouldn't be able to challenge him, not in the state he was in, meaning that Bakugo won. He could only hope the next pebble would make him work for it a little bit more. Jaku Hospital. Nurse Inzuitori was sad to leave the Mustafu Quirk Rehabilitation Center. In her time there, she had loved working with all the patients, and Izuku Midoriya in particular. She had loved working with the excitable boy, and was more than happy to stay by his side in his day-to-day activities to ensure his quirk didn't activate out of his control again. She only wished she could stay and continue helping him, but without all might, he would never make progress in controlling his quirk. Scar existed for combat, and without a challenge, he would be completely unwilling to work with Izuku, instead content with breaking whatever he could get his hands on. Izuku would have been stuck there. Even with her aid, he would be forced to stay in the rehab center and waste his life away fighting against his quirk. And she would have been forced to watch as the child with so much enthusiasm and life slowly drained away to a bitter man with a hatred for his own strength. So when she received a request for her in the operating ward of the Jaku General Hospital, she quickly accepted. Not only was Jaku one of the top hospitals in the country, and she had been asked for by name, but it would also force Izuku's situation to move forward, to not let the boy who wanted nothing more than to be a hero become stuck in a white room, constantly holding back with all of his willpower as his quirk raged. Reaching the operating level, Nurse Anzu smiled as Dr. Ujiko greeted her personally, the accomplished doctor ready to give her a tour of the facilities himself before she set about her new duties. That night would be the last time Nurse Inzuitori would be seen in a long time, the door to the operating swinging shut behind her and Dr. Ujiko with an ominous slam. When Inko Midoriya called her worried about her son, there were only so many ways Mitsuki Bakugo could respond. Inko had been one of her closest friends through college, and she was one of the few who had met Inko's husband, and knew exactly what his quirk was. They were the maid of honor at each other's weddings. Mitsuki was the one who pushed Inko on from her job as a court scribe and on to her dream of being a chef, while Inko was one of the few who would always put up with her in her moments of rage. So when she got called by the police and told her only son was in the ER because he had bumped into a gray-green rage beast, she knew there was more to the story than that. She had been extremely worried, of course. Her son was in the hospital and severely injured, but the thought wriggling in the back of her mind just wouldn't go away. The news reports had said it was a first quirk activation, and the individual was now in quirk rehab. And at the same time, little Izuku was now in quirk rehab. And the monster that had hurt her son, it was a spitting image of Izuku's father's quirk, the Hulk. So once Katsuki was completely healed against the odds, released from the hospital, and settled back into life at home, Mitsuki had confronted him about that day. It only took a bit of prying before the brat spilled. As thick-headed as he was still her son, and she could read his rages like a book. Yes, the quirk that had hospitalized him had belonged to Izuku, and it had only come out because Katsuki was being a much bigger shit than he normally was to Inko's sweet child. While she was plenty mad about it, what was the final straw was Katsuki's attitude about the whole incident. He wanted another go at Izuku when he got out, a rematch when he wasn't surprised by that shitty Deku. Between the shouting and explosions that followed that argument, the neighbors had been concerned World War III was starting in the house next door. But by the time the dust had settled, Mitsuki was triumphant over her explosive brat of a son. The law was laid down in the Bakugo household, and Katsuki was just going to have to learn to live with it. If her son wanted to be a goddamn hero, he would have to follow the rules of being a hero, and Mitsuki was putting them into place now. Heroes were role models for society. They weren't people who took advantage of those beneath them. Even Endeavor, who was infamous for being brutal in his work incontinence, never once had been caught publicly demeaning the efforts of fellow heroes or police officers. Katsuki could feel whatever he wanted. Mitsuki knew she couldn't stop that, but what he showed had to be controlled. He had fought the idea at first, but a single question from her had cut his protests short. Have you ever seen All Might lord his strength over anyone? Seen him look down on anyone because of his position as the #1 hero in the world? That had made the brat think, and for years, a tentative balance was found in the Bakugo household. Katsuki never acted out when not at home, saving his griping about his teachers and classmates when he was safely back at home and away from others. And Mitsuki let his aggression and pride remain intact, albeit slightly hidden from most others. And now, years after the incident, her brat came home looking more smug than she had ever seen him, and now Inko was calling her about burn marks and injuries on her son, who was already struggling to live a normal life on heavy quirk-suppressant drugs. It didn't take a genius to put the pieces together, and once she was off the call with her frantic friend, Mitsuki stormed up to her brat's room. She knew the situation her son had been in, the impossible decision Inko had made, based solely on her faith in her son's spirit. How absolutely horrible she must feel, watching her son move almost in slow motion in his every waking moment. Brat, sit down and shut up. We're gonna have another talk, Mitsuki growled out as she burst into her brat's room, noting its lack of organization. Whatever, you old hag, Katsuki ground out, rolling his chair away from his PC. A video of All Might paused on the screen. Do you remember what I asked you after you got out of the hospital? About All Might? Mitsuki questioned her son, getting a slow nod and a growl in response. Well, let me rephrase it for you because it seems like you forgot it completely. Would All Might attack someone whose quirk was locked away from them for safety reasons? Would he risk that quirk overcoming the precautions put in place to satisfy his own ego? Katsuki froze in his seat, a small trail of sweat forming on his brow and several small sparks crackling on his palms. He clearly understood that she knew, and he was about to get chewed out for his actions. For all the yelling that went on in the Bakugo household, it was when the members of the explosive family got quiet that others should worry, because that was when they were well and truly pissed off. I can understand you might not have positive feelings for Izuku after what happened when his quirk awakened, but that is no reason to lash back at him. You were the one who started that conflict, he was the one who finished it. And that's the end of it. Mitsuki spoke down to her son, watching as his expression twisted from one of slight hesitation to one of anger. I didn't lose that fight to that useless Deku. I lost it to his fucking quirk, and he's nothing without it. Katsuki spat out. Even after all those years spent working with actual pro heroes, he still can't control it for day-to-day life. Mitsuki watched her son as he raged about Izuku, already waiting for him to take a breath with her next rebuttal to his arguments. So you're saying that there is more to people than their quirks, because this is the first time anything I've said that seems to have made it through your thick skull, and you are using it completely out of context. Mitsuki shot down her brat's words the second he paused, forcing him to once again halt in his raging against Izuku. Izuku beat you, so you accepted there were other powerful quirks out there, Mitsuki said bluntly, knowing what her young son had drawn from her words combined with his injury at the hands of Izuku. And now you're saying that they can have any quirk and still be worthless because of who they are. Katsuki gave off a growl and made to argue before Mitsuki's frozen voice cut him off. So what does that make you? Some kind of Superman who has both a powerful quirk and the right personality. You are a lot of things, Katsuki, and you, my son, are not that. Mitsuki's words stole any remaining wind from Katsuki's sails as she finally cut down the pride years of sucking up and being pandered to by others had given her son. You are no Destiny's Child, no prodigy beyond anything seen before. You are smart, yes, and your quirk can be used for heroics, true. But as a person, you have no right to judge others, to put them down to soothe your own ego. That is what you seem to think being a hero means, and for some that might be what it is. But not all might, not what you have repeated over and over again as your goal. If you actually want to be the #1 hero, then you need to get over yourself. You are not the important one, not the center of the universe, or the protagonist of some story. Nothing worthwhile is going to be given to you. Katsuki's silence was telling enough for Mitsuki to know he was at least hearing her words. The actions you take are the ones that matter. I'm sure you remember the news last week, the boy your age with the shadow quirk stopping a mugging. Even though he got in trouble for it, he said it was the action of a hero to help. Instead of doing things like that, you're using your quirk to hurt your classmates, to lord over them like some kind of despot ruler. But Deku, Katsuki tried to get a word in, but Mitsuki wasn't going to stop. Even if he was only 10, her son needed to learn the facts of the world now, before he wound up getting himself more injured than how Izuku left him. Izuku Midoriya has his own struggles and problems without you adding to him. You already know why you can't switch schools, and I'm sure you've guessed the same is true for him. And wasn't that the truth? Living this close to UA was both a curse and a blessing. It meant there was a higher number of local heroes in Mizutofu, as well as the teachers of the academy itself patrolling the area. But it also meant that most schools in the area catered to students trying to make it into the prestigious academy. And Katsuki had managed to intimidate and screw up each and every one of his entrance interviews, leaving only the Aldera public school system as an option unless they wanted to move. Izuku was in the same boat. From what Inko had told her, the few academies that had even offered interviews after reading his application had immediately turned him away because of the state the quirk suppressant left him in. Inko had described it as Izuku moving in slow motion, everything from his movements to his thoughts. So with no remaining avenues within the Mizutofu school district, the remaining options were to leave the two boys in the same school or one of their families would have to move to another district, which was completely impractical considering the problem was Katsuki's shitty attitude, which was a problem Mitsuki was going to sort out. So here's how things are going to work, you shitty brat. You and Izuku will keep going to Aldera until the high school exams, and if you two both happen to make it to UA, like I know both of you want, you'll have plenty of opportunities once you're there to settle whatever you think you have going, and it'll be in a controlled environment where no one is going to wind up crippled or scarred. So until then, if you can't hold yourself back from going after Izuku when you see him, avoid him. Mitsuki laid out her terms and Katsuki, not thoroughly lambasted, gave a grunt in response, already knowing that the other shoe was about to drop. Because if I get another call from Inko saying Izuku came home covered in burns like he did today, neither your father or I will sign off on your UA application. And there it was, the threat that Katsuki would do anything to avoid. Mitsuki watched her brat flinch and nod without protest. Giving her walking explosive ball of trouble a nod back, Mitsuki left his room, already knowing he would follow her words to a T. Katsuki may not change as a result, but he would act like he had. For all his aggression he had inherited from her, Mitsuki knew her son would bury that to chase after his dream. It was why she knew he would be a great hero if he could put his pride aside. He was determined just like Izuku was, but where little Izuku's determination was buried beneath layers of nerves and now drugs, Katsuki's boiled at the surface, lashing out at anyone. She couldn't make the two get along. As much as Mitsuki wished her trouble child and Inko's boy could get along like her and Inko, she knew that was asking too much for right now. But maybe one day, when Izuku had overcome his quirk and Katsuki had overcome his ego, the two might actually be able to have a relationship. Or at least not try to kill each other when they interact. She could only wait and see. Scene shift. Himiko Toga was a great many things, could wear a great many faces. But when it came down to it, one thing she knew she would probably never be was stable. It was just how she was. Her quirk demanded blood as a price, both for activation and for simply possessing. It was an urge that was a part of her being, almost like a vampire's need for blood to survive physically. She needed blood to survive mentally. It was off-putting for most who heard about it. It was why her parents had shipped her away to the quirk hospital. But it was just how she was, not something that could be trained out of her. Her quirk was her quirk. Sure, it had a price to possess, but there were many more in the world that had steeper prices, like her sweet Izuku, who fought against his violent rampaging quirk to try and become a hero. And he would do it, Himiko was certain of that. His quirk was conscious like Fumi's, it came down to whose willpower was stronger, Izuku's or Scar's. Himiko would bet everything on Izuku in that case. No matter how jumpy he could be, no matter how nervous he could get, he wanted to help people. He helped her, he helped Fumi, he even mentioned helping his older sibling before the guy went nuts and died to his own quirk. The whole world looked at him as a monster for his quirk, and he wanted to help them anyway. It was a strength that Himiko wasn't sure she had, but she sure as hell was going to try. Because Izuku believed in her. He believed she could help people if she tried, despite the price her quirk demanded. So that's what she set out to do when she ran away from the quirk hospital. Unfortunately, it was much harder than she first thought. She was too small physically to confront many of the thugs who wandered the streets at night, and with her need for blood at least once a week, the local blood banks were upping their security and making it harder for her to get her fix without hurting anybody. So when she saw one of the smaller local practices on fire one night, she had thought it would be easy enough to slip in and snag whatever blood samples were still there. Of course, she wasn't expecting the building to have a many-story basement filled with people burning while strapped down to a series of beds. They were screaming in pain, begging for help. They needed a hero. So that's exactly what Himiko did. Grabbing one of the many sharp doctor instruments, she darted about the building, cutting the restraints on the beds and pointing the prisoners in the direction of the exit, where they fled immediately. Deeper and deeper she ventured until she reached what she was sure was the bottom floor. There she found a man in a red spandex suit and wielding a katana fighting another man. This one wearing an armored vest under a torn doctor's lab coat. "Excuse me," Himiko announced her presence after watching the two men fight for a time, the inferno slowly growing around them, threatening to collapse the entire building down on them. "Which one of you two is the hero?" The lab coat man just stared at her, his expression showing confusion as to why a little girl in an oversized sweater and holding a scalpel was doing in a burning building. The man in red was much more direct. "Well, it's certainly not this shitstain. He even has a villain name, Ajax the Great and Terrible. Hear his name and fear his mighty presence," the man in red declared, causing both the now revealed Ajax and Himiko to frown, for different reasons. "Isn't that just an American brand of dish soap?" she asked, tilting her head to the side in a thinking pose. "That's what I said," the man in red agreed, pointing at Himiko and doing a happy dance in place. "See, I told you it was a bad name, Francis." Himiko held in a snort at the enraged look on Ajax/dish soap/Francis's face as the man tried once again to kill the man in red with the axe he was holding. "I'm going to kill you, Wilson," slowly and painfully, he ground out, missing the red-suited man with every swing as he danced around the blows. "You know, some would say that you have both anger and obsession problems. I say you're just an asshole, but it's sweet of you to think of me," Wilson had taunted, deflecting a blow of the axe with his katana in one hand and shooting at Francis's knees with a pistol in the other. "Or he's attracted to you and has serious kink issues," Himiko pitched, her word choice stemming from the many situations she had stumbled into in the few months she had lived on the streets for. "I like you, lowly girl. You got a name? Mine is Deadpool, but not Captain Deadpool because that doesn't sound as good," Deadpool explained as Francis's eye twitched as he shifted his glaring between his opponent and the small girl that had snuck into his secret facility. "Himiko Toga, hero without anyone's legal approval," she replied with a thumbs up directed at Deadpool, showing off a smile with her oversized incisors in full view. "I like your gumption short stack. How about you help me take out this walking turd nugget for your big debut? He likes to play with people, but only he ever gets to feel good. Not the kind of guy to share the love, you know." At this point Himiko was pretty sure she had a solid grasp of the situation. So with a salute to Deadpool, she began throwing the many sharp and pointy implements she had scavenged from the labs above at the human dish soap. "Good girl. Make him feel what it's like to be penetrated for a change," Deadpool snarked as Francis made to dodge. Unfortunately, Himiko was 10, and 10-year-olds don't have naturally good aim with throwing knives or throwing doctor's tools. The only weapon that managed to land was a scalpel, and it hit Deadpool instead of her intended target. "Oops," was all Himiko had to say as Deadpool groaned and pulled the knife out of his ass, swearing like a drunken sailor. "We'll work on that later, jailbait. Just sit back for now," Deadpool said, ignoring Francis's attempts to hit him, catching the blade of the axe swing with his forearm and wrenching it from Ajax's grip. "And you bald Shibari fangirl, you are going to die, and while it might not be painful because you can't feel pain, it will be crispy," Deadpool announced, ripping the axe out of his arm and throwing it over his shoulder. "Keep talking, Wilson. Maybe one day it'll come true." Francis tried return fire, but Deadpool had thrown the axe at a support beam behind him, bringing down the ceiling in the center of the room, right where the wannabe detergent was standing, crushing him under a few thousand pounds of flaming rubble. "Welp, half a year and 5 countries of chasing after the bastard that made my face look worse than Jason's, and it ends because he forgot to look up. Disappointing." Deadpool was completely ignoring the fact that the ceiling was continuing to fall around him, choosing instead to start thrusting his pelvis in the direction of the rubble Ajax had been crushed by. "Fuck you, Francis. Too girly to play football and too manly to be invited to prom, and all that's left for you to do is die, motherfucker." His insults were capped off by whipping it out and whizzing on the rubble. Himiko couldn't help but giggle at Deadpool's happy dance, although she was becoming slightly worried, both about the building falling down around them and that the man had just ruthlessly killed someone and was now literally pissing on his remains. But there was blood, so much blood, and with how Wilson Deadpool was healing, he could probably give her enough blood to keep from going crazy for a long time. Although his blood probably wouldn't taste as good as her sweet Izuku's did. She was saving the vial he had given her for when she was truly desperate, when she had to stop herself from attacking someone innocent. Only when her willpower failed would she drink Izuku's blood, and it would save her just like the hero he was. "Ah, Mr. Poole. I think we should leave now, before the building collapses," Himiko said, drawing the quite probably insane man's attention back to her. "Sure thing, sweetie, but quick question. Who are you and why weren't you in the script? I read ahead and everything to make sure I killed this ex-fatty, but you were never mentioned." "I'm Himiko Toga and I don't know what you're talking about." "That sounds about right. Now let's go celebrate with Mexican food." And with that, the world's most unstable and debatably lethal mentor-student duo was formed, although the jury was still out on who was the mentor and who was the student. For some reason, every time they came up with an answer, new blackmail came in and they had to change their mind. Somewhere in the seedy underbelly of the land of the rising sun, a slum in Japan. Wade, Deadpool, Wilson wasn't the best teacher or mentor, Himiko Toga thought to herself as she dumped a bucket of cold water on the man's head. It had been a month since she had met him, and while he was perfectly okay with teaching a 10-year-old how to wield weapons, he wasn't the hero she first thought he was. Maybe the swearing should have clued her in when they first met, or the killing his opponent thing, or the desecrating the body with urine thing. All said and done, Wade Wilson was a mercenary, a highly skilled mercenary with a severe lack of moral compass that allowed him to teach a young girl about all things pointy, stabby, slashy, stealthy, shooty, and boomy. He was also more than happy to kill criminals and let her have the blood, preventing her from going off the deep end like he had. Seriously, if Sanity and Wade Wilson met, Sanity would run away screaming as Wade followed in a food truck trying to make roadkill to serve to happy and unsuspecting customers. As the man sputtered and leapt to his feet, Himiko was already light enough on her own feet to dodge the knife swing that preemptively came whenever Wade woke up. "Good morning, my cute little apprentice. Ready to tackle the day?" Wade chirped like he hadn't just tried to gut her with the machete he kept under his pillow. "Yup, and I made breakfast again, because you are still forbidden from cooking." It wasn't that the red-suited man couldn't cook. It was more that she didn't want the police coming around again because Wade filled a warehouse with pancakes he had cooked for breakfast with ingredients he had taken without paying for a 5th time. "It better not be undercooked sausages again or those little fish. Makes me feel like I'm eating a dick for breakfast. It's buttered toast and a jar of peanut butter today. No edible dicks until you least expect it." Himiko responded with a giggle, skipping out of the room amidst the merc's shouted protests. Nut butter," was all Wade had to say as he ate most of a jar of said butter on a single piece of toast. As the duo ate, the day's planning went a little something like this. Wade pitches an idea, Himiko says no. Himiko pitches an idea, Wade calls it boring. The two glare at each other, which turns into throwing leftover bits of breakfast at each other, then throwing silverware, then the two finding their way to the floor of the empty warehouse they stayed in a full sparring match, complete with knives, swords, and the occasional gun. They had yet to delve into the mass amounts of explosives Wade had stashed around, but it was probably only a matter of time. After Wade stopped trying to kill Toga and Toga stopped stabbing Wade, it was time for lunch and trying to find jobs that fit both of their criteria, which for Wade meant a lot of money, and for Himiko meant hunting down the bad guys. Both agreed the jobs should have ample amounts of violence. So far they were being hired by both sides of a Yakuza gang war to off members of the other side. Only Himiko's ability to transform into off gangbangers kept both sides from realizing they were just paying the merc and his apprentice to off themselves one at a time. It was work they could both enjoy, protecting innocents like a hero and killing for money like a mercenary. Of course, there was only so much work like this available at a time. Criminals rarely paid to have other killed and governments just pass the work on to the heroes they already paid to fix their problems. After today's job, which would involve finishing off one of the two feuding yak herds, work would probably be rather scarce. Which meant Wade would keep on traveling his golden road, and Himiko wasn't sure if she was going to follow. After the quick breakfast followed by knife fight, in which Wade managed not to get stabbed in his bits or face like Himiko had been aiming for, and Himiko worked on her vanishing stealth technique to prevent Wade from stabbing her back, the duo set off to clean up the yaks. The fact that Wade was attempting to read a book in Nepali about yak herding as the two entered the subway drew the merc more strange looks than the fact that he was in a full red bodysuit and was traveling with a young girl in a school uniform and was carrying a large duffel bag with mysterious red stains. When the duo finally arrived at the laundromat that was the front for the yak base, Deadpool finally gave up on his book and Toga drank a water bottle of blood that they had acquired from the last yak they had found from this particular gang. "Okay, here's the plan, we do get help," Wade said as he strapped his weapons to himself in the front parking lot. Himiko was only glad they weren't any pedestrians to call the heroes on them. For a professional, Wade's dictionary seemed to not include words like subtle, or any synonym applicable really. As bloodthirsty as she was, she knew better than to walk around in the open with weapons revealed. "Okay, we do get help," Toga agreed in the yak's body, already knowing how she was going to make the play. Glad for once her transformation had a mutation quirk that made him a walking wall of muscle that Wade had mocked relentlessly for having a small dick. A fact Himiko could now confirm in his body, which brought along the idea of using her special vial to find out just how big her izuku was, blushing intensely at the thought. She wouldn't, of course, but as she was almost 13 and only growing older, the idea seemed more and more appealing. She let the thought linger in her mind as he increased mass formed over the bodysuit she wore under her casual wear stolen uniform and tore the clothing off the form of the large yak she was pretending to be, exposing the little fish to Wade, who cackled at being right. Throwing on a larger set of slightly blood-stained clothing and arming herself with sharp objects and other fun toys, Himiko was ready to go, with the thought of Izu still in the front of her mind. Ignoring the Yandere blush and smile on the sausage and fish-sized man, "Let's roll out." The duo entered the shop, leaning on each other, but before Wade could speak, Himiko stole his line. "Help. Get help. It's my friend. He's suffering from severe groin fungal growth and needs something to sterilize the area." Jailbait says what n dash. Before Wade could finish his retort or the security acts could react, Himiko used her quirk transformed and enlarged muscles to chuck her mentor like a log at them, sending them all over the counter, where Wade quickly snapped the two yaks' necks. "That is not how get help is supposed to go. I'm supposed to be the big dashing hero and you're the damsel in distress. And Fungus, I'll have you know that despite my skin condition, my penis is fully functioning and STD-free. If it weren't pedophilia, I'd offer to show. But that crosses a line I will not cross. I'll leave the yaks to do the little girls. Is that considered bestiality too?" Rolling her eyes at his crude overdramatics, Toga prepared for the next step of the plan, getting to the hidden elevators in the back room. The two entered the back room with pep in their step and made it through the empty room with Wade only tripping once. "Now remember my cute little vampire, when fighting the mighty yak, one must always keep in mind two things: the horns they have on their heads with which to gore you, and the fur on their back that we can shave off to make blankets and sweaters," Wade lectured as they entered the elevator and hit the lowest level button. "Got it? Dodge bullets and knives, steal all their gear, and blood. Can't forget that," Himiko replied with a nod. "And what about the thing those 8 pickle guys wanted us to grab for them while we were in here?" "Oh right, Cheese said something about that. Deadpool mused as the elevator music softly played as the elevator moved down slowly to the obscenely deep basement. I'll leave you to grab the techie stuff then while I make a mess. Himiko just nodded and smiled again, ready to skip off into the yak base and throw her throwing knives. The elevator finally reached their intended floor and Wade gave off a war cry that was incredibly insulting to those of Native American descent as he charged off down the hallway, katana in one hand and extended clip Uzi in the other, firing at any yak that poked up from their grazing. Himiko followed until she reached the first fork in the path, and took the one that lacked the bullet holes in the walls and yaks, which made this the path Captain Deadpool did not go down. And of course, Wade being Wade, he took the wrong path and wound up at the science labs, which was evident by Toga walking right into the boss yak's big assembly room with most of the yak running around to try and find a way to stop the crazed fungal infected man now running through their base. Mako, where have you been? Doesn't matter. Go kill that crazy bastard Merc. He backstabbed us. The boss yak with arrow-shaped hair yelled at her. Himiko honestly didn't remember his name. Started with a W, maybe? Ignoring him, Himiko went to the largest grouping of yaks and reverse pickpocketed one of them before quickly moving away. Not the most subtle thing in the world, but when handling explosives, subtle tended not to work. The live grenade she had stolen when Wade was staring at her exploded, but Himiko had miscalculated slightly. Instead of a normal explosion, it was one Wade had tampered with, meaning the explosion was both pink and larger than intended. The coloration wasn't a problem, the increased size, however, was. Contrary to what Wade preached, bigger was not always better as it turned out. She'd be sure to tell him that later. A little girl? Really? That's who's been tearing my operation apart. The boss yak yelled as the explosion did enough damage to Himiko's transformation to make it slide off her, revealing her true form underneath, dressed in the red and purple jumpsuit Wade had acquired for her. Whatever it was made of let her not be naked when her quirk wore off. Wade just called it superhero clothing and they both went with it. Well, don't just stand there. Shred the bitch. He yelled as the other yaks shook off their surprise and began firing their guns at her. Himiko was quick to leap to her feet, shaking the last of the gray matter that formed her disguise and strafed across the room, whipping out several large sharp objects from their holsters on her suit. But sadly the majority of her arsenal was left behind in her transformation goo. Even if she had those extra stabby implements, it probably wouldn't be enough. Wading into groups of gunmen was Wade's work, not hers. Despite not quite being a teenager yet, Himiko managed to dodge most of the bullets, only a few of them scraping gouges across her suit, leaving bloody trails in their wake. Her training with her mentor Merc the only reason she hadn't been turned to Swiss cheese but the armed yaks. She had to hand it to the boss yak though. He had managed to take a group of people with absolutely no combat ability through their quirks and make them effective enough to have an organization. She landed from a jump and quickly took off again, this time holding her breath and clearing her mind, going into super stealth mode, vanishing to the senses of most of the yaks around her. Unfortunately, her technique wasn't perfect, and the boss yak managed to land a clean shot to her ribs with the longer of his two oddly shaped extendable locks of hair. Although it lashing out blindly as she was landing behind him made her think it was less her ability that was the problem, but rather the man's quirk gave him something along the lines of precognition. Gotcha, bitch. The lead yak growled as his men recovered from her vanishing act, watching as Himiko began landing in slow motion. I am the great chronostasis. I will not be defeated by a child and a red-suited idiot. The boss yak growled, his gray arrow hair whipping about as Hiko finally landed, panic beginning to well up in her gut. The wound wasn't too bad. A clean puncture, and the slow motion she was moving in meant that she wasn't in danger of bleeding out just yet. The yaks with guns pointing at her while she couldn't dodge, however, was a much larger problem. It was like the tint of insanity that Wade carried around him was stripped away and Himiko finally realized how deep she was in shit. Alone, outnumbered, outgunned, and crippled, she was completely at the mercy of professional thugs, ones that leached off of society to exist and would have no second thoughts about doing horrible things to her and others. People who weren't twisted by their quirks like she was, but people who wanted to hurt others, who enjoyed making others despair. We are going to make you suffer, bitch. The Yakuza will rise again. And there it was, the monologue commonly used by overconfident villains and allowed for heroes to pull a win out of their asses. And in this case, maybe but her enough time for Deadpool to get here, and at least for this stupid slow motion to wear off. Her usual plan of run around and dodge while throwing enough pointy weapons to make shish kebabs for an army wasn't an option with her slowed movement and lack of excess throwing knives, and plan B of let Wade handle it was also out, as Wade was probably tearing through the science labs looking for the boss guy, and probably wouldn't realize he had taken the wrong hallway for another 20 minutes. Those were really her only two plans. Maybe coming up with a few more options would help her in her vigilante career, or at least keep her from winding up in a situation like this again. If she survived this, that is. While the boss was still monologuing, Himiko felt the blood spilling from the bullet scrapes and hair stab wound begin to flow normally again, exactly 60 seconds after she had first been struck. Time limit. Not that it really mattered, not when she was this outgunned. But if she was going to go out, she was going to go out with a bang, and feeling as close to one of the few people who believed in her as a person as she could. Before the Yakuza could react, Himiko grabbed the vial she had worn as a necklace since she had last seen her izu and chugged its contents, drawing her last two knives from her waist as she felt the gray goo of her transformation covering her. She only had a brief moment of clarity in Izu's body before she saw the Yakuza unload at her, and a deafening roar fill her ears before everything went black. Her quirk, the one that made her crave blood since she had first awakened, was an interesting one. It required the blood, the DNA of the person she wanted to transform into, and would transform her into that person as they naturally were in that moment. The few times she had used Wade's blood to transform into him, she instead turned into him before the horrific scars covered most of his body. So when she drank Izuku's blood, she took on the form of the boy as he was when he was 10, when he had given her the vial. One thing she wasn't aware of, though, was that her quirk also copied physical quirks. The Yakuza who she had walked in as had an enlarged muscle quirk, so when she transformed into him, her transformation had his quirk swollen muscles. If she were to transform into someone with extra arms as their quirk, she too would have extra arms to wield. So when she transformed into someone who physiology allowed their inner darkness to manifest into a singular personality, containing most of that person's negative traits, all of her own negative features took on a life of their own. Himiko's quirk-born bloodthirst, her anger at her parents and society for forcing her away, at the quirk hospital for never really trying to help her frustration with once again being helpless at the hands of others, even her freshly developing lust for the one person who believed in her. They all coalesced into a single mind when she drank Izuku's blood. And when she stood in his form, his young body that was unable to hold back the powerful personality that had just rapidly developed in her mind, and was perfectly suited for allowing that monster to be set free. It took less than a second for it to break free and throw Himiko from the driver's seat of her own body. In that moment, all of her anger, her insanity, and her passion ran free, and the poor yaks that had crossed her felt every bit of that power as it rampaged through the room. Red skin glinting in the low-lit room as Chronostasis himself was flung about like a ragdoll. It only lasted a few minutes. The amount of blood she had consumed wasn't enough for her to transform long at this level of power, and when the time ran out, the raging monster melted away into her gray transformation goo, once again trapped away in her mind, but unable to be set free. Himiko's body just wasn't built to set her free like Izuku's was. And with all the gathered Yakuza knocked out or worse, Himiko managed to take in the sight for a brief moment before she slipped into blissful unconsciousness, not yet aware of her head's new denizen. And that was where her mentor found her, surrounded by the bloodied bodies of her enemies and a peaceful smile on her unconscious face. Because even if she wasn't fully aware of how she did it, she knew she had beaten the bad guys. She had taken her first step as a hero, just like her Izu always said she could. And for her, that was enough. But one thing both her and Wade missed as he carried his cute little student out of the building was that Chronostasis wasn't as finished as they thought he was. He crawled out of the remains of his base, dragging his two broken legs behind him as he went. He didn't care if it meant he had to work for Kai Chisaki. He was going to get his revenge on the little girl who broke him. The red-skinned berserker that hid under the surface wouldn't catch him by surprise again. Himiko POV. Watching Wade leave was harder than she thought it would be. They had spent a little over a year together, slowly driving each other up the wall. And sure, he was absolutely nuts, but he was like the parent she had never had, and she would miss him while he traveled the world, met interesting people and probably killed them. The bad ones at least. She hoped she had made that much of an impact to his moral compass in their time together. It had been a week since the dynamic duo had finished off the Yakuza gang, and Himiko had spent most of her time since then recovering from her ordeal as izuku, and hearing angry growling echoing in the back of her head. It was a concern to be sure, but at the same time, the normal bloodlust she felt after using her quirk was toned down by a large margin. Sure, she still wanted to find some blood, but the sharp forced focus that normally came with the dark urges was dulled considerably. It was a refreshing and welcome change, one she was glad for since her usual coping method for her more intense bloodlust moments was currently empty. So after Wade and Himiko had their exaggerated tearful goodbye, complete with threats that weren't really meant and hand gestures that would give the elderly a stroke if they saw them, Himiko set out on her quest to see her Aizu again and re-up on her insurance. Against killing people that were innocent, that is. She didn't have the other kind of insurance, because she was pretty sure no insurance company would insure a 12-year-old girl dead set on becoming a vigilante. Crazy people just didn't do boring desk jobs like that. Her first stop was the Quirk Hospital where she and Aizu met, but a quick tour through the head doctor's office while he was out for lunch showed her Aizu had been released half a year prior, another half year after her own release. And that was great. It meant Aizu finally got Scar under control, was finally able to work with his big angry muscle buddy instead of against him. It meant he was well on his way to becoming the hero she knew he would be. And that deserved celebration. And with her Aizu's home address in his file, Himiko knew right where to go to celebrate with her fluffy green ball of heroism. But first came the preparation. It had been a little over a year since they had last seen each other after all, and it would be her first time meeting her probable future mother-in-law. First impressions were everything, so there would be cake and other assorted similar foods. A quick visit to a bakery, funded by the Yaks of Japan's donation to developing heroes who don't care about labels, and Himiko was armed with her weapons of choice. Devil's food cake and a large tub of double chocolate ice cream, the most rich and evil of desserts. And no, Wade, carrot cake was not more evil. Vegetables are not aliens trying to conquer the world and disguising themselves as cake. Thank you very much. It was a quick trip from the warehouse of fun things Wade couldn't bring through a TSA check to the Midoriya apartment. Just a quick subway ride from Hosu to Mizutofu, and a short walk after that, with the shining UA building sitting on the horizon to her left as she made her way through the city. Mizutofu was nicer than Hosu. Not that Hosu was a hive of scum and villainy, but with UA basing itself in the city, more heroes set up shop near the Great School, which made the crime rate one of the lowest in Japan, the only place with similarly low numbers being the Minato Ward, where All Might had his main office. Not that that stopped the #1 hero from traversing the country almost every month for his heroics. It was the kind of city that she wouldn't do much work in, given her slightly illegal line of self-employment, which was sad, as she wouldn't get to see her Aizu as often as she'd like to. But then again, those were the sacrifices heroes made, even ones not sponsored by the government. Pushing those thoughts aside for the time being, Himiko made her way up the fire escape of Izuku's building with a slight skip in her step, making her way to his front door and knocking out a random fast pattern. It didn't take long for the door to be opened by a short green-haired woman, who was slightly on the heavier side of the spectrum, though not by much, nor very noticeable at a passing glance to those who hadn't trained to identify probable occupation by body type alone. With her large eyes and cheekbones wide like Aizu's, this was obviously Inko. "Hello, Mamadoriya. I'm Himiko Toga, Aizu's friend from the Quirk Hospital, and I brought a cake." She introduced herself with a wide smile, holding up the cake proudly, the ice cream still safe in her backpack, along with her water bottle of fruit punch and some knives, and her suit of not being naked under her transformations. But no guns or explosives, that would be rude after all. "Oh, it's nice to finally meet you then, Toga. Izuku talked a lot about you, although, why a cake?" Mamadoriya's words were warm, but there was an edge of caution to them, something Himiko easily picked up on. It was enough to make her drop a bit of her enthusiasm and replace it with some serious face. "To celebrate Izuku getting released, and I got ice cream in my bag." Himiko gestured with her head to the bag over her shoulder, keeping her smile bright on her face, even as her mind quickly shifted through reasons why Mamadoriya might be nervous. She knew Aizu talked about her and Fumi with his mother when she came and visited him in the hospital, and she had heard just as much about the woman in front of her when Aizu got going about her Katsudon. This level of nerves just didn't fit, and the instincts that Wade had quite literally kicked into her were pinging like crazy. And for good reason. Mama Doria let her in and stored the ice cream and cake in the freezer and fridge respectively, before telling her about the conditions of Izu's release. Every horrible detail. Fear. It all came back to fear, and quite possibly jealousy over Izuku having a bigger metaphorical dick than the US government. She knew Izu was at the point where he could control Scar enough not to hurt anyone if he got out. And he was mentally strong enough to not let Scar out every single time his heartbeat started kicking up a little bit. While Scar got physically stronger as time passed, Izu got mentally stronger, becoming more and more able to harness his quirk. Sure, All Might not being able to help him anymore was a roadblock, but with the progress Izu had been making, this was a massive overreaction. From both the head doctor trying to force him to the more secure Americans, and the Japanese government not looking too closely into the case and seeing how close Izu was to controlling his quirk. And at the end of the day, all that happened was that Izu was put further from his dream than he was before, and from the way she talked about it, Inko had to watch as one of the most vibrant people in the world was reduced to the habits of a stoner. "Can I see him?" Himiko asked once Inko finished explaining, her tone now completely lacking the over-the-top exuberance and pep it had when she first arrived. She may not wear it very often, but she knew when to put on her serious face. Just like when she was surrounded and outgunned by the Yakuza, this was one of those times. Except instead of fearing for her one life, she was fearing for the one person she cared about most in the world. Of course, he's in his room right now, trying to meditate, I think, although he usually just ends up falling asleep, Inko said, standing from her seat and leading Himiko deeper into the apartment and to a closed door with an All Might-themed nameplate that read Izuku in bold letters. Before Inko could knock on the door, Himiko gently placed her hand on the woman's shoulder in a reassuring manner, stopping her motion as she turned to look at the young blonde. "It'll be okay, Mrs. Midoriya. You gave Izuku a chance to be a hero like he always wanted. There's no reason to blame yourself. And while it might be hard now, just imagine how happy he'll be when he finally becomes a hero." Being a hero meant more than cutting up the bad guys and being a super ninja spy. It also meant making people smile and feeling better about a bad situation. It was the part Himiko knew she would likely never be very good at, but that didn't mean she couldn't do her best to help when she could. "Thank you." Inko's voice was soft, but Himiko could hear how much her words meant to the woman. With soft smiles on both of their faces, Inko knocked on Izu's door. "Izuku, you have a friend here to visit," she called to her son, and when she was done knocking, it took almost a minute, but the door finally opened and a bleary-eyed Izuku opened the door. The time it took Izu to recognize her, Himiko had more than enough time to give the boy a once-over. His hair was a half-flattened mess instead of its usual fluffiness and seemed to be a shade darker than its usual green. His cheeks were thinner, but not in the healthy baby fat dissolving way, but in a slightly gaunt fashion, like he wasn't eating enough. His skin was a full shade paler than was healthy, making his freckles stand out starkly against his skin. Even back when he was confined to the indoors of the hospital, he wasn't this pale. But it was his eyes that had changed the most. Even ignoring the red in the whites of his eyes that denoted both drug use and lack of proper sleep, the shine that never seemed to leave her Izu's eyes was almost completely dead, a remnant of their former self. It suddenly made much more sense why Inko was reacting so badly to the situation. To have to live with eyes that were so deadened from their former lifelike state would have taken a toll even on her and her perpetual giddiness. "Himiko," Izu finally said as he backed away from the door frame, fully opening the door to his room, showing off the mess within. "Izu," Himiko cheered, pushing aside her shock about seeing how much Izuku was affected. Despite how off-put she was by how different the medicine made Izuku, she pushed it aside and smiled brightly at the boy who believed in her when no one else had. She was certain he got more than enough strange looks day to day. No need to add to the immense pressure he must feel, even if he wasn't able to completely express it. Himiko was quick to glomp Izuku, who only barely managed to keep himself from falling over from the flying tackle hug. "It's so good to see you again. It was so boring not having my friends around. I didn't realize how boring things would get without you and Fumi around," Himiko said with a slight pout at the end, taking in Izuku's muted reactions. Despite all the drugs in his system, the smile on Izuku's face was one Himiko rarely saw on him even back at the hospital, usually reserved for after training sessions with All Might that went particularly well, or a new hero debuted and Izuku got to break down their quirk for the first time. That she could bring that same reaction out of Izuku, even when it was so obvious he was struggling to function as a normal human, made her heart soar. "I missed you both too," Izuku said, his voice slurring and stumbling slightly as he carefully set her down and tried to rub some of the sleep out of his eyes. Now that she was closer to him, Himiko could see that under the dead look in his eyes, there was a spark still lingering. Maybe it had only reignited when he had seen her, but it was there now, and that reassured Himiko that despite this whole mess, Izuku was still the same person he always was and held the same determination. It didn't occur to either of them that they had been standing still and staring into each other's eyes for almost a full minute. Inko gave a small laugh at the scene, causing both Himiko and Izuku to jump apart a short ways, each with a faint blush on their cheeks when they realized just how close they had been. It took almost a full minute after Inko had left the room for the slightly awkward silence around the two 12-year-olds to disperse and for the two to look each other in the eyes again, both very aware of how close to each other they had been. From there, Izuku and Himiko began to talk about the past year, each taking the time to enjoy the other's company after Himiko had checked out of the Quirk Hospital. Himiko told Izuku a little about Wade, shortening her description to "a man with the skills and moral compass to give me some combat skills, and also not turn me into the authorities." She shared snippets of her daily life and even told him of the few times she got to help someone legally, like helping that old blind lady that kept a gun in her sock across the street, or sewing one of Wade's limbs back on because he was too impatient to wait until it regrew on its own. Because damn it, lefty is much better than righty. Izuku flinched slightly at the graphic bits and encouraged her with wide smiles when she was reminiscing. After she had finished, Izuku had grabbed a pair of notebooks off his desk, along with the one he had had in his lap when Himiko had first entered the room. Himiko listened as Izuku shared his notes about both heroes and villains that had appeared in the past year, their quirks meticulously broken down both in broad-spectrum application and down to minute details that Himiko would never have even thought of, much less taken the time to see and catalog in her mind. The two differences between this hero and quirk obsessed Izuku, and the one that Himiko grew to befriend and admire at the hospital, were in the speed at which he delivered his well-observed knowledge and mentions of his own quirk. Compared to the frequent mutter sessions Izuku would fall into when writing in his notebooks, the new Izuku was forced to take the time to enunciate every word completely, and almost always being forced to stretch out his OS by a light yawn. It made his observations much easier to understand, but they missed the life that Izuku brought by being himself, by being genuinely excited whenever a hero broke out a new special move, or their actions confirmed a theory Izuku had about their quirk's potential. Then there was the elephant in the room, or rather, the green rage beast. For the first time in a conversation about heroes, Izuku didn't bring up his own quirk, either in reference to the progress he was making, or how Scar would be able to handle the different challenges of a hero's day. Himiko could see why Midoriya was struggling as much as she was. It wasn't that Izuku had shut down, it was that the medicine reduced him to a shell of himself, both mentally and physically, and with that level of lessened ability, his mood must have been in a nosedive since he started the meds. Not to mention what little shits his classmates were probably being to him. It took until the smell of frying pork hung in the air and the fading sun was covered by passing clouds for Izuku to make his way through the 3 notebooks, although Himiko was sure he had only given her the highlights from each. When he was finished, Izuku had just looked at her with waiting eyes that held only the faintest spark of his overexuberant self, the one that believed with every fiber of his being that he was going to become a hero, was going to learn to control Scar. "You're going to be a hero, Izuku." It was just one small sentence, 6 words, one of which was a contraction, but Himiko knew they meant the world to him. She had the same faith in him that he had always had in her. The belief that the other could overcome the obstacles life had put in front of them. There were no big flowery speeches. Himiko couldn't give them, and Izuku was in no condition to do so even if he wanted to. Somehow, even though they hadn't seen each other in just over a year, the two preteens had absolute trust in each other. No matter the circumstances, be they bloodlust or berserker rage, they knew the other could overcome it. And so the two of them just sat there in comfortable silence, Himiko taking the opportunity to lean up against Izuku's side and rest her head on his shoulder. That was how Inko found them when she came to call them for dinner, making the duo awkwardly jump apart again as their closeness was pointed out to them. Inko let out a rare chuckle as Izuku actually managed to flop over from his seated position and Himiko almost hit the ceiling, she jumped so high. Dinner and the following dessert were much less awkward than they could have been, given the circumstances. Inko had taken hold of Himiko's words and was doing her best to keep Izuku from slipping off into a trance, an effort Izuku matched throughout the entire meal, managing to keep the conversation going. Granted, it was about heroes, but there still was effort. When it was finally time for Himiko to head out, Inko gave the two a moment alone at the door, a knowing look in her eye as Izuku walked her out. As nice as it was to see you again, Izu, Himiko started, the enthusiasm in her voice dying down slightly for the first time all night. She just wasn't quite sure how to go from friendly conversation to asking for some blood. Despite her slight insanity and great self-confidence, Izuku was the one person who was close enough to her to rip through it. It had been a year after all. What if he didn't feel comfortable giving her blood like he was before? Without letting her finish her question, Izuku carefully pulled a small vial from his pocket, its contents the deep red Himiko had always admired and craved. I figured. I already told you. I'll always help you, Himiko. Izuku reassured her, putting the vial directly into her hands and closing her fingers around it. How silly of her. Wade would be laughing and calling her a dum-dum for her assumptions, especially after she had basically waxed poetic about Izu to him for hours. Of course Izu would still help her, would still care about her. It was just who he was. All that time apart had affected her more than him, she guessed. You really are my hero, Izu, Himiko said softly, but with an ear-to-ear smile stretched across her face. And of course, hard-working heroes get rewards from the fair maidens they save. And with that, she pulled Izuku into as deep a kiss as she could. There weren't any fireworks, no cherubs singing on high, just two young people who were doing their absolute best to show the other that they were there. When the two finally separated, both were wearing matching smiles across their faces, and both with slightly dopey looks on their faces. Well, I've got to head out. Government discouraged hero work to do, but I'll be back next weekend. Can't leave my boyfriend on his own for too long now, can I? Himiko said with a smirk before she left, enjoying the dumbfounded look on her Izu's face as she left. Sure, they might be a little young, having both only recently turning 12, but it just felt right. And she would most definitely be back next week. Not just for her Izu time, but to kickstart his training. There was only 3 years until he had to be ready for the UA entrance exam, and while she was sure he could do it on his own, Himiko wasn't going to let him. That was their promise to each other, never alone, and never judged. All Might POV 2 years later. 3 hours a day was not nearly enough time for All Might. Being a hero, standing at the top as the symbol of peace, it was what defined him. His few friends all related to his work, and he was the last living member of his family. All for One had made sure of that. He had never found or even looked for a wife. He had no children, adopted or otherwise. Everything about his life and everyone he truly valued had to do with being a hero. And that was slowly slipping away from him now, just like his body. Sir Night Eye had left him after disagreeing about his successor. He wanted to wait until the perfect fit found him. Night Eye wanted to find someone trainable and teach them everything he could. It was just too clinical for All Might, too cold, too much like something All for One would do. It was his passion and drive to help others that lead Nana Shimura go pass down the quirk to him, and it was necessity that drove the passing of One for All before that. Gran Torino, although he avoided the man after the particularly nasty sparring session he had had when he was first released from the hospital. All Might had tried to push himself and get back into the field, but Torino had quite literally knocked sense back into him. And while he did care for the man, he was certainly not someone he would interact with on a daily basis by choice. David and a great deal of his other friends were all overseas in America, where he had debuted and gained a fair bit of notoriety while he trained away from All for One's long reach. Sure, he could call them, but it just wasn't the same as face-to-face interaction. The local heroes, mostly UA teachers and recent graduates, were just that, colleagues, and most of them slightly intimidated by him. And then there was Naoma, his childhood friend and go-to man in the police force. The two were once thick as thieves. All Might dragged them in, and Naomasa kept them off the streets after that, his quirk making him the perfect interrogator. But as he did less and less hero work, he saw less and less of Naomasa, He was too busy working, and All Might had to spend a long time in therapy learning how not to flex his muscles and utilize his muscular one-for-all form. Never before had he been so grateful that One for All gave him a pseudo-quirk that allowed him to have a civilian identity. Otherwise he would have had to retire after the accident, not just because of the injury, but because his body was in no condition to hold One for All any longer. And that was it. Hero students, hero teachers, hero colleagues, hero support teams. Hero, hero, hero. That was his whole life. And he was content with it. He had chosen it. To sacrifice any personal life and most personal desires to become more than just a person, but a symbol. His entire life was dedicated to ending all for one and protecting innocence. He had been prepared to die facing the monstrosity, and was honestly surprised he hadn't. He gave everything he had into being a hero, and he didn't regret it, not one bit, not even for a second. It was just hard, feeling his dream slowly slipping out of his grasp. It left him feeling empty and shockingly alone, seeing as he was one of the most famous and well-known people on the planet. But it was his burden, one he knew might be an outcome, if he somehow managed to win. And he would bear it with a smile as he aimed to complete his last goal as a hero, finding his successor. Help! Purse snatcher! And that was his signal. All Might quickly shoved his grocery bags into his large, baggy cargo pants pockets and shifted into his muscle form, his catchphrase rising to his lips naturally. Never fear, why? I am here. And with that the chase was on. The villain was slippery, quite literally. Being made of sludge made it near impossible to restrain him with just strength, as well as making him surprisingly quick in tight spaces. Every time he took a swipe at the villain, his hand would displace a chunk of the villain's body, but not enough to stop him. He did manage to snag the purse back, and was forced to take a detour to pass it off to an officer with the location of the snatching, so its owner could reclaim it. Although he lost sight of it for only a short while, the sludge villain made the most of the time All Might wasn't following him, and by the time he had caught up to him again after a quick dash through the sewers, he was accosting another civilian. A quick grab and smash later, and the rather stoned-looking boy was ripped free and the sludge was splattered across the tunnel. With nimble fingers, All Might grabbed the 2 light sodas from his groceries, one of the few sweet beverages his stomach could handle, and quickly dumped the contents out. A small sacrifice to capture the villain, but he had been looking forward to them. They were the last melon sodas the grocery had too. It only took a few minutes for All Might to collect the scattered pieces of villain that had already begun to reform. The 2 eyes, the only solid pieces of the villain, were carefully slipped into separate bottles, just in case. Finally completing his capture, All Might turned to the civilian he had rescued and felt his breath catch in his throat. While his first impression had been he had saved a young student, based on the messy black uniform, that had begun to experiment and needed a firm push away from illegal substances. But whatever was in this boy's system was much stronger than a casual street narcotic. His eyes weren't just red and bloodshot, but they had deep bags under them that seemed to pull his eyes closed for an extra second every time he blinked. His skin was an unhealthy pale tone, a stark difference from his uniform and dark green hair that had a light fluff to it, making it the most awake part of the boy. Despite the villain attack, he seemed to be almost asleep rather than just in shock. "Are you okay, young Shounen?" All Might asked, allowing himself to deflate slightly so he could stay in his muscular form for longer if he had to, a handy trick he had picked up for public events and the like. "Jewist finey." The boy's voice was hampered by whatever he was on, but despite how horrifying it was to hear such a young man sound destroyed, All Might could swear he had heard the voice before. Something about it was itching in the back of his mind. "Jewist had the deuces up this morning, puts me and bit more out of it than usual." As if he expected All Might's next question, the boy had reached into his slightly waterlogged backpack and pulled out a small laminated card and handed it to All Might with an exhausted hand. All Might quickly skimmed the card and felt what was left of his stomach drop back into the sewers had come up from. He knew this prescription, he knew what it was meant to counter. He knew the name at the top of the little medical card in his hands. "Young Midoriya, I didn't recognize you. You look so." All Might trailed off here, not quite sure what to say to the boy in front of him, the son of one of his few friends, the boy he had sworn to help control his quirk and to protect, that he had failed when he got himself injured, and had been forced onto this horrible drug or risk being shipped to America and given the same treatment as his father. It's All Might, Izuku said slowly, accepting the card back from his former teacher and pulled another object from his backpack. This time a thick black and only slightly damp notebook with several sticky notes stick out from various places. He, with as deft hands as he could given his current condition, flipped open to a spot a little over halfway through the book and handed it to All Might. I know you've been busy. Only just managing to resist the reflex to sign what had been handed to him, All Might quickly read through several pages of scarily comprehensive and detailed notes about his own hero work. His declining time spent active, fewer international appearances, and multitude of deals made with various medical companies. All laid out in slanted, messy handwriting, a shockingly concise timeline building up to one conclusion. Wasn't sure if it was an injury or you were sick, but I get it. The sooner you get better, the sooner you can help more people. All Might was left speechless as he looked between the notes in front of him and the boy who, with only the slightest hint something was wrong, managed to track and pinpoint his movements. And all that while on enough drugs to send most people into a coma. I'd like to talk a bit more about this later, young Midoriya, but I have to bring this villain in. Can you think of a time for us to meet later? All Might asked, gesturing to the sludge villain now trapped in his soda bottles. You can come over for dinner if you want, All Might, Izuku said, carefully taking back his journal from All Might and tucking it back into his backpack. It's usually just me and my moom, unless my friend Drew ups in to surprise me, Izuku finished, a blush painting his cheeks in the most expressive display All Might had seen since he pried the villain off the boy. That sounds wonderful, young Midoriya, but as a warning, I will be in my civilian wear, so you might not recognize me. Midoriya just nodded and gave him a small smile and thumbs up. Very good, my boy, and so, I shall see you this evening. And with that, All Might flexed one for all back into action and leapt away, headed to the police station to turn in the sludge villain. Processing him was as smooth a process as ever. Naomasa quickly accepted the bottles and released the sludge into a specialized cell where a quick questioning was followed by official charging and the rest of the process. And in less than an hour, All Might was back out on the streets, his groceries once again in his hands instead of crammed into his bulky pocket, albeit 2 light melon sodas short. From there, it was a short walk to the apartment he was staying in to drop them off before changing into a nicer pair of overly baggy clothes before he headed over to the Midoriyas. Their address still the same as he last went there years ago, back when Bruce was still in Japan, where his friend tried to build a life before the American government had him deported back. He was just glad he would be able to use his main form, despite how dead it looked. He just didn't have the energy after a full day of heroing to use his muscular form for a meal and discussion. Inko would be able to recognize his civilian form, even if he did look much more dead than he previously did. He wouldn't even be surprised if she had put the pieces of his hero identity together while she was at it. She always was more shrewd than she let on. Being top of her class in UA's business course was evidence of that. Call the hero course selective if you like, but the business students were far and above more cutthroat. So it was with relative surety that he knocked on the door that night, his mind already going over the discussion that would occur between himself and a pair of greenettes that both were far more intelligent than most first thought. So his surprise was even greater when a blonde girl answered the door, poking her head out first before fully opening the door when she saw him. Her hair was tied up in a pair of messy buns almost like panda ears, and her bangs hung unevenly above her forehead. Her ears had the slightest point to them, and a pair of oversized incisors revealed themselves when she smiled brightly, if somewhat unnervingly, at him. You must be Mr. Yagi, you're right on time, Mama Doria is plating up dinner now. And with another face-stretching smile, she made her way back into the house, a light sway in her step as she left the #1 hero to invite himself in. It may have been a few years, and she was no longer wearing hospital scrubs, but All Might recognized Himiko Toga from the few times she had been waiting for Izuku after their training sessions back at the hospital. Her golden eyes with cat-like slitted pupils were something he wouldn't easily forget, nor was the chill that ran down his spine when she looked into his eyes, although it was noticeably less than it was back then, an edge taken off of her visage. She had clearly found the help she needed, although if his memory was correct, she had run away from the hospital before being released. Carefully slipping off his shoes and closing the door behind him, Tashinori made his way into the dining room of the apartment. When Midoriya had mentioned a friend before, he had not been expecting young Toga, although it made sense now that he thought about it. The two were thicker than most thieves back in rehab, and if he had to guess based on Midoriya's earlier blush, they were even more so now than before. Upon entering the apartment proper, Tashinori was glad to see not much had changed since he had last been in the apartment. He even remembered the few nights he had crashed here in what he assumed was now young Midoriya's room. Inko herself was a less inspiring sight. It was clear the past few years had affected her greatly, but the sharpness in her gaze was still there, even if it was somewhat dimmed. Settling himself in the seat across from young Toga and between Inko and young Midoriya at the square table, the four began to eat as an awkward silence began to fill the room, each member engrossed more with their food and not looking at the other occupants of the room than anything else. Tashinori wasn't quite sure how to broach the subject of training izuku, and having young Toga present as well made him reluctant to speak up while she was present. That silence lasted until a loud smack of chopsticks being slammed down under a pair of palms, and everyone looked up to see Himiko leaning across the table, staring at Tashinori intensely, a thick silver chain becoming visible as she strained her neck to get closer to him. It was off-putting enough that Tashinori actually leaned back a bit in shock. "Have we met before?" she asked after studying his face for a few moments, her eyes darting about as the took in his whole appearance. "I'd think you'd remember meeting someone as worn out as me." All Might trailed off as Himiko crooned triumphantly as she reached across the table with both hands. Carefully taking one of his bangs in each hand, she lifted them straight up, revealing his hero form's signature hairstyle. "Yup, there it is. Nice to see you again, Mr. Mighty. Gotta say though, you look better as a ball of muscle than as a famine victim," Himiko said bluntly, releasing his hair and going back to eating as if nothing had happened rather than a rather large invasion of personal space. "Iyan," Izuku said with a light chuckle as he too resumed eating the katsudon in front of him slowly. Inko rolled her eyes at this and tossed the boy a yen coin across the table at her son, who only fumbled it once before managing to grab it from the air, tucking it into his pocket. "You bet on if I could figure it out?" Himiko asked with wide eyes, exaggeratedly flickering her gaze between the mother and son. "And you bet against me. What happened to girl power Mamadoriya?" Himiko accused with a pout, pointing at the woman with her chopsticks. "You know Izuku Himiko, he'd never bet against you, which leaves me on the other side of things," Inko defended, shrugging her shoulders. "And she's never let me down," Izuku added, his face the closest thing to smug he could while sedated as he was. "Ah, izu," Himiko cheered, jumping from her seat to glomp the boy, who did nothing to stop her, instead leaning into the contact. That lasted for several moments before Himiko pulled away and pecked the boy on the cheek, inspiring an epic blush on his face and causing him to miss his mouth with his next bit of food, an action that drew laughter from the entire table. With the ice broken and All Might's identity exposed, conversation around the table became much more frequent and relevant. "I would like to offer Izuku help, whatever I can give. I can't use my time in hero form to spar with him, nor can he use his quirk for combat like we did before. But between the two of us, we can find a way for him to get through the UA entrance exams. If it comes down to it, if he were to train his body alone and manage to score in the top percentile on the written exam, he could get through the exam without using his quirk." All Might finished his proposal to the two greenettes, his fellow blonde listening in as well, having moved to a seat almost on Izuku's lap rather than the seat next to him at the table. They certainly were an unusually affectionate couple for how young they were, All Might observed, but given Himiko could produce reactions from Izuku that defied what he should be able to under the drug, All Might didn't let it bother him. "It'll have to be more than that," Inko said, watching both All Might and Izuku with a careful eye, the one that had given her the resources to maintain a comfortable lifestyle even now, years after she had taken on the big names. "Physical training doesn't woo-woo work. I get limited benefits because of the meads." Izuku finished the thought, brandishing his bicep to the hero. And while he was by no means all skin and bone like Tashinori himself was in this form, there was distinctly less muscle than there should be for someone who claimed to regularly lift. "And the written exam would have to be much easier or shorter than the rumors have it. Izu falls asleep during tests now. He would probably only get halfway through the exams before conking out." Himiko added, bonking Izuku's head lightly with her fist, tilting her head and sticking out her tongue to add effect to the statement. Her eyes also somehow turned into excess as she did so. Then we'll figure out how to use Scar to get the strength needed to get through. And I've got a few sources I can call that might be able to help too, Toshinori said with finality, already thinking of his few communications with Bruce over the years. He had developed the drug Izuku was on now, and he would be the most likely to know how to beat it. I'll take every IA chance I can get. I will become a hero. Izuku agreed, not slurring in a sentence for the first time all night. All Might could see the fire back in his eyes, the one that shone just before he turned into Scar at their previous training sessions. But now they would be looking to draw out Scar's monstrous strength rather than suppress it. Excellent, young Midoriya. Give me a week to form a training plan. I shall text you a meet-up point if we swap numbers, All Might said with finality, chuckling internally when he saw the muted stars in Izuku's eyes at getting his favorite hero's phone number. Even now that he was older and suppressed, Izuku was still the fanboy he remembered. I've got to head out to Izu. Plenty of work for me to do, Himiko said as she got up, pecking Izuku full on the mouth in full of both Inko and All Might, drawing a blush from the hero and an eye roll from the mother. Himiko's openness was clearly nothing new and not something that would be going away anytime soon. I'll walk you out, Mr. Mighty, Himiko said once she had finally stood up, straightening the school uniform she wore, although All Might wasn't entirely sure as it bore no logo, simply matched the design of many private institutes. Once they were both out of the apartment, Himiko stopped Toshinori with a hand on his shoulder, drawing the two to meet eyes. Where once humor, affection, and a touch of airheadedness sparkled, was now a pair of blazing gold orbs that held nothing but deadly seriousness. Where a smile once never left her face, now sat a grimace worthy of Endeavor himself. You aren't just leading him on, are you? She asked. Even her voice had dropped any sense of playfulness.